Guess which character I'm thinking about. Your clue is that they have white hair and red eyes. If you guess Luffy, then you are correct. If you guess Bonnie, then you're also correct. If you, for whatever reason, guessed Hody Jones, then you're in the minority but still majorly correct. And if you guessed King, then sire, claim your crown. And if you guessed Carrot, Wanda, Inuarashi, Nekomamushi, Beppo, or any of the Sulong minks, then it is a Garchomp for you. And we're not even done yet. There are so many correct answers to this question, because what I've just asked you is one of the most frustratingly vague guessing games that I ever could have conjured. Because a surprising amount of characters in One Piece have this distinctive white hair red eye effect, which generally appears in a transformed state, comes equipped with enhanced abilities, as well as a stamina cost that threatens the life of the user. And if we didn't see the deeper connection going on here, then you could almost accuse Oda of lazy design work. But the white hair and the red eyes are very intentional. It's evidence that every species on this One Piece planet possesses an innate genetic ability to access their own version of the Gear 5th form, their own expression of freedom. And it's no coincidence that the minks, the fishmen, the Lunarians, and the daughter of a buccaneer, the four closest races to the Joy Boy, are the ones who are manifesting this power for their causes. And we're going to see a lot more of that going forward in One Piece. But before we get into it, this video was inspired by Mr. Randy Troy pointing out this connection during the latest Reverie. He has a lot of cool ideas, and there will be a link to his channel in the description below. Check it out. Well, let's begin at the heart of everything, which is always Monkey D. Luffy. Luffy unlocking Gear 5th was not a light switch power-up, meaning that it did not appear instantly as a result of a single moment. It was a very slow process, like leaving a bucket under a leaky tap, drip drip. Luffy's ridiculous power kept building through Gear 2nd, Gear 3rd. Now the bucket's starting to look a bit half full. Then we started to get the deity connotations with Gear 4th, and Snake Man even refined this, until Luffy was finally ready to embrace Gear 5th. Reaching that power was like climbing a very long staircase, with each step unlocking a small part of it. But here's my hypothesis. Luffy is not unique. Everyone has access to this sort of sun god form, however it requires a unique process to reach, and many people simply do not have the drive that Luffy possesses to attain this level of freedom. However, some do, and some have already taken their first few steps towards achieving it, with Jewelry Bonnie being the most successful but nowhere near the only example of this. And when Bonnie first activated her full-on Nika Future form, a lot of people were surprised, as if this idea came out of nowhere. What was happening, Oda? Has One Piece fallen off? But it didn't come out of nowhere. This was a very slow process for Bonnie as well. This was the freedom that she had been working towards her whole life, which admittedly is only 12 years, but if anything, that should just make you feel worse about what you've done with your life. I know that it certainly makes me question my personal decisions, but Bonnie had something of a nepotistic advantage, as she was indoctrinated into the Church of Nika by her father, Bartholomew Kuma, renowned buccaneer, and so Bonnie had that core belief instilled in her from a very early age. That is an important factor. Without that belief, Bonnie could not have achieved this. And when she ran away from the Sorbet Kingdom, she did exactly what Luffy did by conjuring her own version of Gear 3rd to defeat Alpha, and took a step towards unlocking the Nika power just like Luffy did during Enies Lobby. But it was only through Luffy's inspiration on Egghead Island that Bonnie was able to complete the transformation and don the iconic white hair and red eyes. In Bonnie's case, she reached the pinnacle of freedom through her own unique mechanism, a devil fruit which allows her to manifest multiple futures so long as Bonnie believes that those futures can exist. So you might think that this is an exception to the rule, an outlier created by a stupidly overpowered fictional fruit, and you can also argue that taking on the white hair and red eyes are a result of Bonnie plagiarizing Luffy. In a vacuum, that's pretty fair. But what's a lot harder to explain is that this power can and has been reached with other special powers that are not devil fruit related in complete isolation to Luffy. A prime example of which can be found in the strangely similar white hair, red-eyed Sulong transformations of the Mink tribe, which are often referred to as the true power or the true form of the Minks. At the time that this happened, we didn't quite know enough about this to make any sort of world-shaking connections, and evidently nor did the anime staff, because originally in the anime they changed Carrot's voice to sound different in Sulong form, but they did later drop this, which is important because for the sake of consistency, voices do not change in the Sun God form, which this isn't, but it's almost certainly a step on the staircase to freedom, like how Luffy's gears were his steps. It's something that have allowed the Minks to get 1 degree closer to their true form, which is also startlingly similar to how Luffy describes the Gear 5th sensation. And this transformation was achieved by the Minks via their own unique methodology. The Sulong transformation is initiated by looking at the full moon, and they must have a completely unobscured view of the moon, meaning that this entire race is hard countered by Nami conjuring a cloud. But I also do want it on the record that the moon is not an essential part of this transformation. It can be achieved through other avenues, as we'll discuss later, but the cost of the Sulong form is in concert with the cost of Gear 5th. If the Minks cannot control their transformation, then they can quite literally fight themselves to death in a single night simply because they expend too much energy. And the same thing happens to Luffy in Gear 5th. He uses it until he reaches a point where all of his energy vanishes, leaving him on the verge of death, if not arguably dead. Now, this can often comically be fixed by feeding Luffy food. That's the most common way to deal with it. However, things do get a lot more desperate as well, such as that one time during the raid on Onigashima where Luffy had to restart his own heart against Kaido. If Luffy wasn't who he is, then this transformation would have killed him many times over. Probably not many times, just once, because he wouldn't have had the opportunity for the rest. But it's not something that Bonnie was able to maintain for more than a couple of minutes, and the Sulong form initially wasn't something that Carrot could maintain for any longer than a few minutes either. It's exhausting, and it will cost your life if you ignore that exhaustion. I should say that Gear 5th and the Nika form are also obviously symbolic of the sun, whilst the Sulong form is more of a representation of the moon. And to that, what I would offer is that this form may have been developed a millennia ago after Joy Boy was defeated and the world began its long night. With no sun to turn to, the Sulong form was perhaps symbolically developed as a way to protect the world during the night, something to replicate the hope of the sun god Nika one day returning, and to the credit of the Minks, it does appear to have worked for them, because it gave them the power to protect their civilization for the last 800 to 900 years. And they're not the only civilization to have come up with a method like this, because fishmen have also managed to achieve a white hair red eye transformation thanks to the energy steroids that once resided within the Tama Tobacco, which currently doesn't reside anywhere because it blew up. But this was actually something of an ancient relic said to give people the power of growing older, as well as to make one as strong as 1,000 men. But in regards to the first one, Vanderdecken actually planned to use its power on Shirahoshi to make her old enough for it to be socially acceptable to marry her, but little did he know that it's not socially acceptable for anyone to marry Vanderdecken, no matter what the age or any other demographic happens to be. Now, one of the more obvious messages of the energy steroids is that drugs are pretty bad. Don't do them because your unearned power comes with great consequences, like draining your life force and leaving you on the verge of death. You know, the same thing that Gear 5th and the Sulong transformations do, so we're seeing many a pattern emerge here. However, there's also some special mythology behind this particular consequence. The Tama Tobacco was a mysterious box that was given to Uroshimataro by Otohime, the princess of the sea. And he was given this box with the explicit instructions to never open it, and look, long story less long, Uroshimataro did eventually open it, and with it a white puff of smoke emerged, poof, and he was instantly transformed into a white-haired old man. And this was because during the short time that he spent at Otohime's palace, many decades had passed in the real world. Time was functioning differently, so the Tama Tobacco was used to quite literally store Uroshimatara's old age that he should have incurred, and did after he opened it. And you can see how a lot of this folktale inspired what happened on Fishman Island, which had its own Otohime, and the consequences of consuming the pills in the Tama Tobacco led to the rapid aging of the new Fishman pirates. But while thematically appropriate, again, this effect is not unique. Whether it's devil fruit, whether it's moon, or ancient drugs, the same thing happens. The user assumes a white-haired, red-eyed form, and then their stamina is rapidly drained, leaving them on the verge of death, if not outright dead. But also, the energy steroids are not a light switch power-up to access the Sun God form, or a step along the way to the Sun God form, and they didn't turn Hody into his white-haired incarnation immediately. It was a gradual process of increasing substance abuse. In fact, the first time we saw him use them, all it did was strengthen him and turn his eyes red. Although this is different in the anime because Toei initially gave Hody crimson bloodshot eyes with blue pupils. However, this is incorrect. In the manga, Hody's eyes are depicted in the exact same way as everyone else who gains access to the white hair red-eyed form. And of course, to access this form, Hody had to OD on the energy steroids, which had him in excruciating pain on the verge of death, before settling into the apparently trans-racially iconic white hair red-eye aesthetic, which sounds like a very artificially induced version of Luffy's Gear 5th Awakening, where he was pretty much killed by Kaido before the ability could manifest. And I would offer the same explanation for the existence of the energy steroids as I did for the Sulong transformation. During the Void Century, after the defeat of Joy Boy, the fishmen needed a way to protect themselves, and so they sought to emulate the Sun God powers as best they could and rationed the mountain pill form to survive the long night. But some races in the One Piece world are also much further along in this process and did not require an artificial awakening. Which brings us to the Lunarians, who, as far as we're aware, all have white hair. And when I say all Lunarians, I do of course mean King, but also every Seraphim that has been created with his Lunarian bloodline elements has gone on to have white hair as well. But King himself also has red eyes, although although they are quite muted and sometimes the anime even kind of forgets the king has red eyes because he's quite commonly just given black eyes for reasons. But at this stage, I think that even the most skeptical of fictional pirate appreciators can see that this probably isn't a coincidence, because we now have 3 ancient races directly connected to Joy Boy who share the white hair, red eye features as well as the Joy Boy himself, Luffy. And really, what I'm waiting for on Elbaf is another similar white hair, red eye effect with a giant, because they're also connected to the sun god and perhaps on an even deeper level than the previously mentioned races. If this trend continues, we will definitely see it in one of them as well. Perhaps even Loki will reach this level due to his insistence that he is a sun god himself. But Lunarians as a whole are another reference to the moon, and perhaps a race that were determined to protect the world during the long night. However, unlike the minks and the fishmen, they had a much rougher go of things and appear to have been hunted to functional extinction. Currently, it's only through the power of brain science that Lunarians have continued to propagate, and that would of course bring us to the Seraphim. And while the Seraphim do have white hair, they do not have red eyes. What they've got is yellow eyes with a funky star in the middle, although S-Hawk is an exception to this as he also has an outer circle of orange surrounding the standard Seraphim yellow, which no doubt has to do with the secret behind Mihawk's special eyes. But in lieu of that, a lot of the Seraphim have also been dressed in all white outfits, which I imagine could be a reference to their angelic inspiration, but also it draws pretty direct similarities to Luffy's all-white Gear 5th outfit. Although there are exceptions to this as well, like S-Bear, who was given his special star top, and S-Flamingo, who was given a lovely Hawaiian shirt. But for the most part, the Seraphim do also embody the Gear 5th aesthetic. In fact, if you took Luffy, Bonnie the Seraphim, the Minks the Fishmen, and the Lunarians, put them in a room with some ancient drugs on a night with a full moon, then you would have an accidental white party. No one came to the event thinking that that was the dress code. It's just how an almost absurd amount of One Piece characters seem to look when they've reached the peak of their abilities. And by the way, the Seraphim are also referred to as the Saikyo no Jinrui, which means the strongest form of humanity. So this is what peak humanity looks like. White hair, white clothes, wacky eyes. And the Seraphim were created by Vegapunk as his way of showing us what humanity has the potential to become. And each race seems to have developed their own unique pathway and their own journey to this peak. However, these roads are not exclusive, as Chopper seems to have developed his own version of the drugs that were in the Tama Tobacco, not on purpose but naturally through his research, and he's now given Minks a quick and dirty way to access the Sulong form in the odd event that they don't get attacked during the evening of a full moon, as we saw with Beppo. And there are also hints to this idea baked very early on into the One Piece cake, as the nation of Alabasta also has its own version of the energy steroids. This is a concoction called Hero Water, which the 4 Sumurageri guards consumed in order to take on Crocodile, which significantly boosted their strength and speed, but significantly unboosted their living capacities as they all proceeded to die, quite sadly. And what's obviously missing here is that they didn't get the white hair or the red eyes. But my meta reasoning for that would be because this was just so early on in One Piece that Oda hadn't thought of the form yet. Because the existence of the Hero Water does make a lot of sense, as Alabasta is another one of those nations linked to Joy Boy via its ancient monarch Nefertari Lily. And all of these phenomena, especially the white-haired ones, seem to be linked by Joy Boy. The fishmen who were directly associated with him via their ancient princess, the Minks whose civilization is built on Zunesh's back, who was a comrade of Joy Boy, and the Lunarians, something. I don't know exactly what their connection is yet, but King likes Joy Boy. So it is currently my belief that deep down in every being, even you, somewhere there is the ability to access this pinnacle of freedom. Usually transformations in One Piece are a sign of an altered lineage factor. That's the explanation for how devil fruits work anyway. You consume the magical fruit and it restructures the user's lineage factor to accept this new reality. However, this white hair, red-eyed phenomena cannot be explained by that. Sure, you could argue that the energy steroids and Chopper's drug may temporarily alter this lineage factor. However, the Minks and the Lunarians at the very least possess these traits naturally, and it's a common trait that is manifested across 4 different species now. So I believe that it's something latent in all people that ensures that the will of Nika will never die, as each person has a potential to become a sun god and continue the legacy. And what this means for One Piece going forward is no doubt a hell of a lot more white hair and red-eyed people emerging within the most unexpected of characters as they rise up to enact the dawn of the world. The most famous wedding in One Piece was when Sanji almost got married to Charlotte Pudding and ended up wrecking an obese woman's cake before promptly apologizing by baking her a new one as he should. But while we, readers of fictional pirate stories, were captivated by the great One Piece bake-off, a second wedding was happening at the exact same time elsewhere in the world, one which involved another Emperor of the Sea. As on the cover of chapter 838, we see one red-haired Shanks attending said wedding, which looks like it went rather well. However, this wedding has become one of the more enduring mysteries in all of One Piece, one that we've been trying to solve for about 9 years now, which is just who got married that day and why is it heavily speculated that it was Lucky Roux, but also, if not Roux, then who? I often hear some people suspect that this was Yasopp's wedding just to make Usopp's reunion with him that much more awkward. Hello son, here is me, Yasopp, and your stepmother, not Banshina. We've been having a fantastic time without you, and honestly, I'm a bit sad to see you now. A lot of people think it's Yasopp because they forget about the chapter cover immediately before this one where we see Yasopp with the rest of the Red Hair Pirates. In fact, let's go through them, shall we? Across chapter 837 and 838, we see Yasopp building Snake, Bonk Punch, Monster, and Howling Gab right in the back there, sneaky. He got his name because he essentially yells his opponents to death. And in addition to Shanks himself, we also have best buddy Ben Beckman on the left and Rockstar on the right, a man whose sole claim to fame is that he is the newest member of the core Red Hair Pirates, and the older boys like to play various pranks on him, like sending him to deliver a message to Whitebeard that they know Whitebeard will take rather poorly. So that's almost everyone, but there are still 5 Red Hair Pirates unaccounted for by these cover pages. One is Uta, and she does actually exist in the canon One Piece world. However, she was created for Film Red, and then Oda liked her so much that she was inserted into the series, so it's pretty safe to say that this is not her wedding, although imagine if it was. That would mean that Shanks is showing up here to be the father of the bride. But we also don't see Hongo or Lime Juice, 2 senior officers who should really be present for an event like this. I don't think we know about Lime Juice yet, but Hongo is the doctor of the Red Hair Pirates, and he's such a good doctor that it even appears that he may have managed to race swap himself for a special flashback appearance in episode of Luffy. Some pretty undeniable skills there, but I'm going to be completely honest and very unscientific here. I don't think that it's either Hongo or Lime Juice that are getting married simply because neither of them are interesting enough, but there are 2 other members who are, one of which is this mystery monkey who's seen performing cleaning duties aboard the Red Force, who I'm incredibly keen to find out more about, because this isn't Monster. I need to emphasize that. He gets mistaken for Monster, but no, in fact, a second monkey has hit the Red Hair Pirates. But the main candidate I and many others have their eyes on is, of course, Lucky Roux, because he is a senior officer, but he's a core senior officer, one of the big 4, because the Red Hair Pirates have always been characterized by Shanks, Ben Beckman, Yasopp, and Lucky Roux. This is the square that keeps this crew functioning. The rest of the Red Hair Pirates in chapter 1 are glorified set dressing that got unbelievably lucky, and essentially Ringo starred themselves into one of the greatest pirate crews of all time. And that's why it strikes me as particularly odd that Lucky Roux isn't on one of these 2 cover pages. Because Hongo and Lime Juice, I could feasibly believe that Oda forgot about them or just didn't have enough space to put them in and didn't care. But one does not simply forget about Lucky Roux, which is one reason why he finds himself as a groom candidate in the fan base. We get to see so little of the Red Hair Pirates, so why would Oda deliberately exclude Lucky Roux unless he was busy elsewhere at the time, perhaps at the altar getting married? That, or maybe he went to the reception early to eat all of the food before anyone else could get there. But we do have other clues to examine. It's also very helpful to look at the geographical makeup of the island itself, as we appear to be on a very hot and barren yet quite cactus-rich island, which is described on each volume cover as a, quote, certain ruined island. The ruined part is very interesting, and it makes a lot of sense because hosting an event featuring the crew of an Emperor of the Sea is probably best done in neutral territory, which is why the most natural answer to the island question isn't particularly natural anymore. The first conclusion many come to due to the heavy cactus presence is that the Red Hair Pirates are within the Shishino Kingdom, which literally means the kingdom of the dead ruled by King Tacos, whose design was ever so subtly inspired by Mexican culture, in addition to that of bounty hunter Jean Ango from the Carter Coliseum, who is 99.9% from the same kingdom. His hat is almost exactly the same as the one possessed by Tacos, and the name of the kingdom itself is of course a reference to the Day of the Dead. And within the cover story, you can also see what appears to be a Christian-inspired church, which also adds a bit of religious spice to our Mexican flavor, as something absolutely wild like 91.3% of the population population of Mexico is some denomination of Christian, mostly Catholic, so everything's adding up except for the things that don't. One of those don'ts being that the Chisinau Kingdom, to the best of our knowledge, is not ruined. In fact, Tacos participated in the most recent reverie, meaning that at the very least they still have the funds required to pay the exorbitant world government admission tax. And also, because it is a world government island, that means it's probably not the best place for the red hair pirates to be traveling to. But luckily for us, we do have cactus clues elsewhere, as cacti are not exclusive to Mexico Island, which we discovered first thing after hitting the Grand Line, because there's also Whiskey Peak, the cactus island, although that probably isn't the right answer. Although, I don't know, when you think about it, they did have a nun among those 100 Baroque Works bounty hunters, which implies at least the facade of a Christian church somewhere. And after the dissolution of Baroque Works, it may very well be considered a ruined island. The only residents that we currently know of are Miss Monday, Mr. Nine, and their baby Nande. I don't think it's Whiskey Peak though, because when you're on Whiskey Peak, you cannot escape seeing those giant cacti. They are always in the background. And in both images of the red hair pirates on the ruined islands, they have completely clear and unobscured skies. Meanwhile, Full Shout Island is also a possibility. This is Koala's home island, which Fisher Tiger returned her to, and was then promptly ambushed by the Marines. And Full Shout is a classic example of quirky Oda naming, because it's likely a pun based on the Japanese word furusato, meaning homeland. So when Fisher Tiger returns Koala to her homeland, he is literally returning her to homeland. And given that Koala was a slave, it is likely that Full Shout was not a member of the world government and was instead used as a bit of a slave farming location. We've seen a similar process occur in the case of Whitebeard's homeland of Sphinx Island. That was a nation too poor to pay the tax to become a world government member, so instead it was perpetually slave farmed, and that's part of what inspired Whitebeard to become a pirate in order to attain the strength to protect it. But not every island is lucky enough to produce a Whitebeard, and it could be that sometime in the past 12 years, Full Shout was raided and even destroyed and ruined by the world government, hence becoming a certain ruined island. However, the cacti of Full Shout are much more rounded, and the architecture of the few buildings we do see doesn't match any of what we see in the Red Hair Pirates cover pages. So if you have other cacti related ideas, then feel free to leave them in the comments, because a lot of people forget about the cacti. Don't do that. A lot of people just focus on the ruined island part. And that's how we get stuff like people initially thinking that Shanks was attending Mihawk's wedding on Kuragana Island, where the bride was suggested to be Perona. Now look, in all fairness, this is a fantastic location for a man in his mid-40s to marry a woman in her mid-20s, because Kuragana Island is not in the domain of the world government, or at least it wasn't. I guess it is now. But back then, this was just an island ravaged by war, one which Mihawk and Perona were working together to clean up and make more arable again, as we saw in the same cover story as the wedding actually. Here we have Mihawk and Perona tilling the former battleground in front of the castle, but the argument here was that the two of them were cleaning up and preparing for some sort of special event. I don't know, it's like a wedding. However, the fact that this happens during the same cover story as we see Shanks at the wedding all but confirms that these two events were happening in separate areas at the same time, because this is all happening on the very same day that it was announced that Luffy defeated Doflamingo. But something else we should ask that may or may not be helpful is, what is the precedent and etiquette for pirate marriage? Because piracy is the kind of lifestyle that doesn't necessarily mesh with the concept of settling down with a significant other. However, even though One Piece is a series that tends to stay far, far away from romance, the world of pirate marriage is fairly well explored territory. The most recent marriage we witnessed was Gotti and Lola getting married after a handful of seconds knowing each other on Dressrosa. But also on Dressrosa, we saw the romantic engagement of Sai and Baby Five, meaning that Dressrosa really is living up to its name of being the land of love and passion. So getting married as a pirate, it's generally fine. Even Luffy was okay with the concept of Sanji getting married. The only issue he took with it is if it meant that the Straw Hats would come under the banner of the Big Mom Pirates. But in order to prevent that, Luffy preemptively told Pecoms that if Sanji does get married, then they all work for him. This was the very same chapter, by the way, where Luffy teased Zoro about being worried about Sanji, to which Zoro threatened to kick Luffy, which is very sweet because kicking is, it's Sanji's thing. Zoro shows his concern in his own ways by threatening violence in the style of the person that he's concerned for. But the point is that getting married is no issue if you're a pirate. In fact, nothing is. If you're a pirate, then having a wife is kind of like having a child. If you end up with one for whatever reason, then you can just yass up yourself back to the boys because of something maintaining global stability in between bouts of extreme drunken debauchery. And you know who else might be setting a precedent for the life of a married pirate? That's right, Shanks himself. It has also been suspected that Shanks was attending his own wedding, marrying Makino. However, this theory is debunked by the fact that Makino is apparently already already married at this time, because on the cover of chapter 806, if you zoom in very closely on Makino's left hand, there is a ring on her rather appropriately named ring finger, an event that occurred during the time skip, because when we see Makino at the end of pre-time skip, this ring finger is completely and rather scandalously ring nude. She also has a baby, a rather big baby, which Oda confirmed was hers in the SBS of volume 63, because a lot of readers were very much investigating the possibility that this was Shanks' baby, and to this, Oda's exact words were, "Seems Makino-san became a mother. She looks very happy. The father is maybe that person. Yeah, probably that person. So we have that person striking again, and it is almost certainly Shanks. Every time Makino and the baby are shown, there is no reasonable father candidate to be found amongst the Fuchsia Village residents, which then implies that Shanks married Makino during the time skip and went on to have intercourse, which produced a baby. And one of my favorite theories in regards to this baby is that this is the child who is going to inherit the Straw Hat from Luffy after Shanks' tragic demise. But this somehow takes us back to Lucky Roux. And another piece of evidence against Roux is that according to volume 4 Billion, he's really, and I mean really bad with women, so getting one to marry him may prove quite difficult. Although at one point there was a hilarious theory that Lucky Roux had actually married Lola, because Roux is bad with women, but Lola proposes to literally every man she encounters. However, as mentioned before, Lola did remain single up until very recently when she married Gotti. But given Makino's example of enringment, easiest thing to do, you would think, would be to check Lucky Roux's ring finger. We have seen him a handful of times since this mystery wedding. Although his hands are usually full or otherwise obstructed, the only clear view we have of the hand in question is in chapter 1054, and you can very clearly see that there is no ring. But look, is the absence of one small line enough to kill this theory? No, it's not. If you thought that, look, and I'll explain properly why in a bit. There's a very good answer to this. But first, if not Roux, then who? Because we're definitely running out of candidates at this point. I mean, we do still have Hongo, but we also saw Hongo's ring finger on Gartel Island, and it's currently unoccupied by a claim. So what does that leave us with? Lime juice? So I guess we've not been able to confirm, but I just don't see lime juice being the answer to any question except what do you not want to drink? So who else do the Red Hair Pirates know and care about to the extent that it caused all of them to temporarily cease pirating? Well, it could also be an ex-member of the Roger Pirates, of which there are no shortage of candidates. We could be at the wedding of Mille Pine, for example, perhaps Ganryu or even Pitomu, and others, so many others. There are a lot of what I'm going to assume were eligible bachelors aboard Roger's ship, but the only one we know of so far who has managed to sustain a long-term relationship with a female is Silvers Rayleigh. And wouldn't it be quite something if this was his wedding, finally marrying Shaki? So their exact legal status in One Piece has always been quite confusing and vague. Sometimes in some media, Shaki does call Rayleigh her husband, but it depends very heavily on the translation. In the Viz translated English manga, for example, Shaki does not refer to Rayleigh as her husband. She simply calls him he. In English, Shaki states, "He's about 100 times stronger than you boys." But in Japanese, it's very different. In this sentence, Shaki refers to Rayleigh as Uchi no Hito, literally meaning person of my household, which can be used to refer to family members who share the same house. However, culturally, whenever this is used by a woman, it is almost always referring to a husband. But look, the official English did see this sentence as being vague enough to not want to deal with the problem altogether, so they just didn't bother with it due to the high risk of making a mistake. Shaki and Rayleigh are probably married though, because fan art of the two of them has made it into multiple Usopp galleries, which are special showcase sections in the manga volumes, and the comments next to them always seem to identify them as a married couple with no ambiguity whatsoever. So long story less long, it probably wasn't Rayleigh's wedding either. Although the fact that neither Shaki nor Silvers Rayleigh wear wedding rings is more evidence in favor of Lucky Roux. Perhaps pirates don't wear them as a symbolic act to denote freedom or something along those lines. Because this is a trend that we can see with Sai, a character that we know we saw get married, and he doesn't wear a ring. And two other pirates we know that have legally bound their lives together are Aladdin and Charlotte Praline from the Sun and Big Mom Pirates respectively, and look, no ring. But then on the complete opposite end of the accessory spectrum, we have Capone Gang Beige, who very greedily and blingsomely wears all of the rings, although none of them appear to be a wedding ring. And crazily enough, this also applies to Shanks as well, although that's primarily because he's missing the arm that the ring finger would traditionally be on. But also, the obvious retort to this is, mate, internet man, why are we holding a story made in Japan to a Western standard? Maybe people in Japan just don't wear wedding rings, And that's definitely true, not all couples do. However, I would also say that Japan is the second largest market for engagement rings outside of the United States, which is all thanks to a remarkably successful marketing campaign in the late 1960s that installed this Western value into Japanese society. So it is still one of the more ring-heavy nations, one of the heaviest. And the One Piece franchise takes full advantage of this, as it sells officially licensed engagement rings, where you can choose from one of 68 Jolly Rogers hats, tattoos, or even the Marine Justice motto to etch onto yourself for almost $3,000 for the high-end variety. But look, here is what everything in this video comes down to. Can I tell you whose wedding this was? No, no one can. Can I tell you what island it was on? Also no. Can I tell you anything including miscellaneous semi-related One Piece fun facts surrounding this event? Well, that one I can do. Why, yes, I can. And in the end, One Piece is about the journey, not about the destination. So don't worry about the answer. And I hope you've enjoyed your 15-minute journey through this video. Now get off the toilet and go and make all your dreams come true. Who were the original 4 Emperors of the Sea? Well, as introduced to us by a monkey on Water 7, the original group consisted of Edward Newgate, Whitebeard, Charlotte Linlin, Big Mom, Kaido, no special names, and Shanks, red-haired Shanks. But they are not the original rulers of the New World, in much the same way that the 7 Warlords of the Sea that we first met were not the original 7, because at the very least Bartholomew Kuma was the 8th 7 Warlord to be anointed after Ace defeated Hanafuda, and who knows how many other times Warlords have been toppled and replaced over the last 2 decades. The Emperor system is very similar. It's just much rarer to see them rise and fall. However, one such event did occur 6 years ago when Shanks became the latest individual to be recognized as an emperor, which means that his reign at the top of this world is exactly as old as Toko. And examining his position isn't as easy as looking at, say, Luffy's reign as an emperor, because Shanks he's more of a traditional emperor with a core crew, an extended fleet, and many territories to govern. So who occupied Shanks' seat before then, and who had domain over all of his island things? Because in order to survive in the New World, you either need to be someone or you need to belong to someone. As the destiny of all islands who do not come under the banner of an emperor or the world government is to serve as a neutral battleground for pillaging by any of the aforementioned parties. And look, we've met Shanks' Grand Fleet. They're fun characters. I especially enjoy Ball Fingers Garatini of the Puddle Pirates, because just what are any of the words I just said? But the Red Hair Pirates Coalition has been formed out of those deemed too weak for any other emperor to even bother with. Shanks seems to have domain over incredibly vulnerable islands in the New World, as any of them can be commandeered by one rogue Bartolomeo in half an afternoon. So how did they all survive this song? Well, this is an answer that we know. And it's not just gonna be Shanks that gets called into question, because the original emperors are in fact named in One Piece media, and guess who isn't among them? Not only newcomer Shanks, but also Kaido was not part of the original lineup, and even though Big Mom was present at the time as a solid threatening empire, not even she was originally given the title of emperor. Now, the following historical revelation comes to us courtesy of the Ace's story novels, which immediately, I know some people are gonna go, but man, on the internet, they are not canon. However, these two shockingly are. I'll get into more details to satisfy your fictional pirate publishing curiosity later, but these novels were specifically marketed by Shueisha and endorsed by Eiichiro Oda as canon. And what we're concerned with today is part 2, which is literally twice the size of part 1. It's wild. And this follows Ace's journey into the New World and eventual joining of the Whitebeard Pirates. And as part of this, there's a nice bonding moment between Ace and 4th Division Commander Thatch right at the beginning of Chapter 5, where Thatch is explaining the hierarchy of the New World. And here, Thatch says, the balance of power in the New World is shifting. It used to be all about Roger, Shiki the Golden Lion, and Whitebeard, until Roger and Shiki dropped out. Big Mom's always had her own nation though, even back then, Thatch explained, his hands on the side railing. Now it's Whitebeard, Big Mom, Kaido, and Redhair, said Ace, listing the names of the 4 emperors. And this is about as straightforward as it gets. The previous 4 emperors weren't even the 4 emperors. What we used to operate under was a 3 emperor system. And this would have been the era between the God Valley incident and Roger's execution. So we're talking the period of between 24 to 38 years ago, and the balance of power was divided between between the eventual Pirate King Gol D. Roger and the Rocks Pirates alumni Whitebeard and Golden Lion Shiki. Big Mom was also mentioned as a bit of a side glance, but we'll get to her in a bit. To start with though, Shiki had the closest setup that we would ascribe to a modern day emperor. He had a fleet consisting of 51 divisions, each with its own commander, which is very similar to how Whitebeard had his crew set up, although his forces only consisted of 16 divisions, and it may have been even less back in the old days. So it's safe to say that Shiki and Whitebeard, intentionally or not, were the ones who created the blueprint of the emperor requirements. Most emperors since then have seemed to follow in the footsteps of Shiki by focusing on building military might and mistaking Whitebeard for having done the same, when in reality, dude just wanted a big old family. And then there's Roger. Roger feels like an outlier here because he, like Luffy, did not focus on the traditional metrics of power and influence, and yet he somehow managed to achieve just as much, if not more influence than his contemporaries, just like Luffy. And it makes me wonder if Roger back in the day may have had his own grand fleet, but one more akin to Luffy's, composed of Roger's supporters but not under his direct command, in order to give the world the illusion of emperorhood. In the same way that the Straw Hat Grand Fleet serve as a more public face of the Straw Hats by conducting interviews, spreading the good word of Luffy, and performing other assorted very loud actions. But if we go back before the era of the three emperors, power was even more terrifyingly consolidated, as prior to the era of Roger, Shiki, and Whitebeard, there likely would have only been a singular figure seen as an emperor-type person, which would be Rocks D. Xebec. There was no one equal to him, and his fall had the cascade effect of one emperor being fractured into three, which fractured into four, and eventually five with Luffy, before consolidating back down to four. But I also want to examine what Thatch said about Big Mom, because she is mentioned, but not in a space in equivalency to Roger, Whitebeard, and Shiki. Charlotte Linlin was there, diligently growing her empire and ticking off a series of future criteria to become an emperor, but she wasn't anywhere near close to the big three. And the way it's written is if Thatch is saying, the old days were all about Roger, Shiki, and Whitebeard, and Big Mom, she was also there, but not a lot of people were investing in that stock, and perhaps they should have, because you gotta feel bad for everyone that poured their life savings into Shiki coin at the time. Greatest market crash in One Piece history, that was. But I suppose you could refer to Charlotte Linlin as Emperor 3.5 of this era. She was the undisputed fourth place, but there was just too large a gap between fourth and third. But also, here's something very important. There is a slight generational gap between Big Mom and the big three. Charlotte Linlin is 68 years old, and if any of the big three were still alive today, then they would be in their 70s and 80s. So Charlotte Linlin is like an awkward in-between generational presence, a bit too late to catch up to Roger, and a bit too early to be considered the next batch with Kaido, who is only 59 years old. To which you may say, man, on the internet, age doesn't mean a whole lot, just look at what Luffy's done. He's an emperor now and he's only 19. It is meaningless. And in most cases I'd say, yeah, but for Big Mom, her age is everything, because her core power base is her own family, her own children. A big part of the reason why Charlotte Linlin could not truly rise to prominence in this era was because her family wasn't large enough or old enough yet. The Big Mom Pirates as an empire is almost entirely dependent on the Charlotte siblings. So let's be generous with time and say that we're examining how things stood 30 years ago, just 8 years after God Valley, so plenty of empire building opportunity. During this era, Charlotte Katakuri was 18 years old, Charlotte Cracker was 15, Smoothie was 5, and Snack had only just been born that year. Those are the sweet commanders, the central power base of the Big Mom Empire. And furthermore, you also have characters like Charlotte Mondor, one of the most integral logistical figures in the empire, who is only 8 years old, and in total, 41 out of the 85 Charlotte siblings hadn't even been born yet. So it makes a lot of sense that Big Mom wasn't able to compete on the same level as the other three. Individually, yes, she was up there. In raw power, she could punch them and stuff, but her empire and her influence was a very small garden compared to the overwhelming forest that it would grow into. And that's not good enough, because the emperor system only functions with balance. It exists because each individual faction is deemed equal to the others. And you can't maintain balance if you can't take the load. Although we know the Big Mom certainly can take a load in other respects. But this also brings up a pretty massive flaw with the early emperor system. Because there was no power worthy of becoming a fourth emperor, we had a point of compromise arise when Shiki wanted to form an alliance with Roger. In the modern day, an alliance of two emperors is a big issue for the Marines. But the beauty of the four emperor balance is that, let's say Big Mom and Kaido wanted to form an alliance pre-time skip, that is a huge problem. But in response to this, Shanks and Whitebeard could have formed an alliance to combat it and force the New World back into a theoretical stalemate where no side is willing to go all out. And this sense of balance did not exist in the era of three emperors. Let's say that Shiki's wish did come true and he managed to form an alliance with Roger. That would have left Whitebeard powerless to stop them. The only way that an equal force could have been constructed would be for Whitebeard to form an alliance with the world government, which is very unlikely. And that's why 4 emperors is a very good number. And at this stage, I should say that whether the term emperor was actually used or not, that is effectively what Roger, Whitebeard, and Shiki were. I'm not hugely interested in the semantics of the word itself, as well as when it became widespread public terminology, which is something that the English fan base tends to get a little bit stuck on whenever this topic comes up in online conversation. I usually see at least one comment stating, well, they're called the Yonko, which means 4 emperors, so there has to have always been 4 of them. And that could be true. Yonko could be a word that was developed specifically to describe the dynamic that formed after Roger and Shiki left prominence. But alternatively, if there were only 3 emperors, then they also could have been called the Sanko, because words are good like that. You can kind of change them to give them different meanings. Although the thing that really gets me is when people refer to the emperors as the Yonkos, pluralizing a word that's already plural. Yonko is already plural. Adding an S to it just makes it sound like you're saying the 4 emperors. But let's get to some very important questions of canon. The Ace novels are written by 2 different authors. Part 1 is by Sho Hinata, and Part 2 is where all the juicy lore stuff happens, which was written by Tatsuya Hamazaki, who is quite a prolific One Piece light novel writer, as he handled the novelizations of almost all of the One Piece movies. The 2 key exceptions that I see are Stampede and Film Red. He's also done novelizations of One Piece filler arcs, and look, I didn't even know this, but apparently Warship Island has its own light novel written by this dude. So he's not a complete freelancer. He's not new to the world. He's been quite deeply associated with creating One Piece material since 1999. However, it's also not the most encouraging sign that the vast majority of his work is so based in non-canon material. But in a very unique move when advertising the Ace light novels, Shueisha did market this as officially canon material, and Oda also gave his blessing to use his world with the following statement: I hope the author of novel Ace will feel free to imagine Ace's personality as much as possible. And more importantly, one of Eiichiro Oda's editors in 2017 stated that the authors frequently consulted with Oda. Oda also read both novels and gave feedback, which means that either Oda had no issue with the 3 to 3.5 Emperor system, or that Oda specifically gave advice to phrase it like that, which is very relevant because to the best of my knowledge, no other One Piece novel has been treated this way. Not even novel lore, which has a very similar premise to Ace's story, following lore and expanding on his history, although I have yet to find any statement of evidence of Oda's direct involvement in that one. Either way, even though the Ace novels were not written by Oda, they were supervised by him. And unless something directly contradicts the manga going forward, they should be considered canon. Because when the publisher says that this is canon, then we should probably believe them until proven otherwise. However, all of that still doesn't quite answer our original question, because Roger and Shiki, quote, dropped out of their positions decades ago, with Shiki's reign at the top all but ending with his defeat at the Battle of Ed War. However, his last stand was 24 years ago when he fought Sengoku and Garp at Marineford, which was also the same year in which Roger was executed. So think about that. The balance of the New World was maintained by 3 factions, and in the space of a year, 2 of those 3 disappeared. Roger turned himself in and disbanded his crew. Meanwhile, Shiki threw his ambition away due to the outrage of what happened with Roger, and the New World was left with a massive power vacuum to be filled, with one very large hole being comfortably filled by Charlotte Linlin and her ever-aging brood. But this was also likely when the ascension of Kaido occurred, because he'd already commandeered Wano by then and assembled the key infrastructure of the Beast Pirates. And of course, Whitebeard carried over, but it's still only 3 emperors. And it would be another 18 years after this that Shanks would be properly recognized as the 4th emperor and complete the composition as we were first introduced to it on Water 7. So did this system simply remain the Sanko, the 3 emperors, until Shanks barged in, or was his seat previously filled with the buttocks of another? So we're very, very close to confirming this at the time of recording this video, but we have not, so this is a section that may not have aged well. However, at the moment, we now know that Prince Loki of Elbaf was defeated by Shanks 6 years ago, the very same year that Shanks became an emperor. And we also know that Loki set sail from Elbaf to cause chaos and destruction throughout the world, with a 2.6 billion berry bounty being placed on his head, which makes him the only person other than Mihawk who has crossed the 2 billion berry mark without being considered an emperor at some stage. So maybe Loki, on his mission of destruction, occupied that 4th emperor space. And perhaps Loki proposing to Lola could have ended up being an alliance of emperors. Again, this probably isn't going to age well, but another candidate that we should not ignore is Ochoku, another former Rocks Pirates member, and up until a year ago, the ruler of Hachinosu, because he would have been in a very similar position to Big Mom. Individually, very powersome, and he had access to a large kingdom of pirates, but not quite at the level of the Big 3. But when 2 of those Big 3 disappear, oh, in comes Ochoku, yes. He's such a weird entity, because he didn't just survive in the New World until Blackbeard overthrew him during the Rocky Port incident, but he also managed to rule his own kingdom without the support of another emperor, and this one was secretly backing him, which, maybe. But given that each of the other emperors were former members of the Rocks Pirates who all hate and despise each other, I kinda doubt it. So it's not crazy to think that Ochoku was once an emperor, but lost his ability to compete and retreated to the remnants of his empire, which is very much what the Charlotte family are doing at the moment. They've lost their place in the world, but they're still quite firmly in command of Totterland and their previous forces. But also, we should never discount the Shanks effect. It is entirely possible that it was just 3 emperors until Shanks barged his way in. That's just the kind of guy he is. He made his presence too big to ignore and perhaps created his own empire out of all the scraps of the other emperors, combining the islands deemed too worthless to devote resources to protecting and maintaining. But also, don't be surprised if, just as it turned out to be the case with the Warlords, there is a missing emperor lurking in the history of the One Piece world that Oda has yet to reveal to us. The power of love is very real. It does a lot more than just cause nosebleeds and make babies. And in fact, there are a few select individuals in the One Piece world who are capable of wielding this love, as demonstrated by the self-proclaimed preacher of love, Scopogaban. We are on the cusp of entering a whole new era of One Piece. Because if the idea of willpower can be manifested into tangible smacks in the face, then why not love? Which could very well be the counter to the power of the Abyss, the Mark of Emu, a man-thing who is lacking the love of his precious Nefertari D. Lily, thus making the Abyss more of a deadly metaphor for Emu's own innate emptiness, and hence why Scopogaban may be able to break the Abyss by mixing in a little bit of love. But it is incredibly important to note that Scopogaban is not the first old man to show us the power of love. That title, as well as almost every other title, would belong to Monkey D. Garp, whose self-proclaimed Fist of Love is arguably even more terrifying than his regular fists of general punching. And this fearsome love has not gone unnoticed by fans over the years. In the SBS of Volume 62, a curious reader wanted to know exactly what happened on Water 7 when Garp arrived and punched Luffy, which negated his Devil Fruit abilities. Now, the obvious, but in this case wrong answer to this would be Haki. However, it is something else. In Volume 45, when Garp punched Luffy, why did it work? Was it Haki after all, or was it love? To which Oda responded, it is love in this case. And when it comes to Luffy, probably in all other cases as well. Luffy has stated in the past, nothing is more painful than Grandpa's fist, and while it could be because Garp was using Haki on his rubber grandson at a very young age, it's more likely that Garp was using love, which is even worse. And that Garp may very well be one of the most powerful people on this planet, not just because of raw meat strength and not just because of the willpower of Haki, but because he can harness the power of love. At the time, and really up until very recently, this Garp phenomena was brushed off as a gag, because similar things have happened in the past. Nami is another character capable of negating Luffy's abilities, and the same question was once asked of her as well. Blows shouldn't hurt Luffy, so why does he get bruises and swelling when Nami and the others beat the crap out of him? Tell me! And tell me Oda did do. When the crew beats up on each other, it's always an admonishment with a strong sense of purpose, which is why it works so well. It works on his spirit. I bet Nami is thinking, it's his spirit that hurts deep down, right? I guess not. And even though Oda did the very classic thing of negating his answer right at the end of his answer, I think it's still very much on point. Nami is able to hurt Luffy's spirit. And one theory as to why it's actually possible for Nami to hurt Luffy is because it's actually Luffy's ability that's allowing it. Gear 5th is the power for Luffy to bring his imagination into reality, and that's not always a good thing, with bits of it having been seeping through long before the full awakening. And so a fun explanation is that Nami can only hurt Luffy because Luffy believes that she can. And that's a very unique thing about One Piece that I bring up quite often. Just because something is a joke doesn't mean you can dismiss it, because wacky jokes are very real fictional power sources. And when it comes to love, I have to say, this is far from a joke at this point, which we can clearly see in the love god himself, Sanji. During one of Sanji's finest moments on Egghead Island, he leapt into battle combat against Admiral Kizaru to protect one Jewelry Bonnie, and he shocked tout le monde by actually managing to block Kizaru's attack and mate Just look at Kizaru's face in response to this. That should tell you everything you need to know about how insane this maneuver was, and Sanji's explanation for this phenomena was that love is stronger than light. Kizaru replies by saying that if that were true, then physics as we know it is dead. And I think I'm here to confirm that fictional physics as we know it is indeed dead. When I was reading this weekly, I very much brushed it off as a gag. Ha ha ha, your classic Sanji simpy white knight moment, where sure, love may have been inspiring his interactions, but we know that what actually allowed him to block Kizaru were his awakened Germa modifications. But the more we explore the final saga, the more I realize just how wrong I was. Or if I was right, it was the right answer with the wrong working. Back on Whole Cake Island, Sanji and sister of Sanji, Reiju, had a lovely heart-to-heart after Reiju's memory assault, where she stated that her mother gave her life to protect the emotions that Sanji was born with, and that's why he was born kinder and gentler than anyone. And so whilst Judge and Sanji's brothers considered Sanji to be the Germa's greatest failure, Reiju and Sora consider Sanji to be the greatest success of the Germa. There's also been a long time, semi-comical theory that Sanji is overly amorous because he has the emotions that his brothers are missing. So whenever he feels love, anger, sadness, or sees a woman that makes his bread rise, Sanji feels those emotions 4 times harder than any other human, and while that mostly manifests itself in a wide array of horny jokes, it is true of every emotion. When Sanji gets angry, he gets so angry that he catches on fire. Not always in a funny way either, in a very literal way. This isn't just anime visual license happening, Sanji is actually catching fire. And I quite like this idea because it means that Sanji not only received the superhuman modifications that Judge tried to embed him with, but the greatest modification he received was from his mother Sora. That heavily increased access to emotion, which made Sanji kinder and gentler than anyone. And this is something I believe that Sanji has since gone on to embrace as his modification. During his fight against S Shark, Sanji quite proudly tanked a shark fist to the face with his modifications, and he stated, "What would you know about the power of love?" And when I saw this, I did the same thing. At the time, I wrote this off as Sanji being a tiny bit delusional, almost in denial about his modifications and trying to supplement that with his own preferred reality. But I think that Sanji is actually onto something here, whether he realizes it or not. And given the idea that he has access to a well of emotion that others simply cannot dive deeply enough into, perhaps Sanji was born particularly sensitive to the power of love, in the same way that characters like Enel or Isa were born with the gift of observation haki. There was just something within both of them that allowed them to tap into that power much easier than most. Because Sanji has been saying stuff like this throughout all of the One Piece, and speaking of Skype here, that brings up one of the greater examples. During Sanji's first ordeal of balls, with the second one being the 2-year time skip on Momoiro Island, Sanji cracked it at Satoru and he said, "Anyway, dumpling guy, you keep harping about challenge this and challenge that. Frankly, I couldn't care less about your stupid rules, but considering that there are a couple of damsels waiting for me to rescue them, I accept your so-called vassal's challenge, but you should know I have my own challenge, a love challenge," which has also been translated as an ordeal of love or a trial of love, both of which I prefer. But whatever he says, it's promptly made fun of by Luffy and Usopp later on because they cannot feel what Sanji can feel. In this moment, it is entirely possible that Sanji is genuinely tapping into the power of love to defeat with his feet Satoru, and that he is able to see a very special aspect of this world that even the greatest of haki users may be completely blind to. And what I love about this is that the power of love is something that Judge never even came close to considering. His whole scientific career has been dedicated to creating the ultimate battle warrior, and it turns out that he completely scientifically castrated himself by focusing on the removal of emotions, and thus losing access to one of the greatest powers that a human being is capable of conjuring. And as a side note, Judge, by modifying his sons to be completely subservient, also may have taken away their ability to tap into haki, because they have no real willpower of their own to exercise, and so Judge has ended up creating an objectively inferior version of humanity with none of its greatest strengths, and that's why they're pretty useless without the raid suits to compensate. And when Sora begged Judge not to erase the hearts of her children because they wouldn't be human anymore, Judge replied with this: "Monsters they should be. All that matters is for us to win in war, and I will bestow upon my children the greatest power possible." And look, that philosophy is scarily similar to what Saint Summers is trying to enact enact on Elbaf. All that matters is winning the war. Everything else is irrelevant and even counterproductive to that end, be it education, happiness, and most definitely, love. And in fact, what's very clear is that Summers sees love as the ultimate weakness of life. I'm not going to go through his whole speech again because I've done that enough times on this channel, but Summers is currently on Elbaf trying to exploit the weakness that is love. In his scenario, he's specifically focusing on parental love and exploiting this emotion to have parents essentially end their own lives in an attempt to save their children. And it's very tempting to think that the ones being bound here are the children by the literal thorns, but what's also happening is Summers binding the parents and the adults with the love for their children. And with what we've been exploring in this video so far, that is a very dangerous idea for Saint Summers to be playing with. It's like a kid messing around with fire without understanding the true power of fire as one of nature's greatest forces. And I do think that's quite an apt comparison, as love in One Piece tends to be compared to fire quite a bit, especially through ideas of burning passion. The difference being that most people respect fire, or at the very least, they understand it, which is why the Holy Knights are actually trying to use it as we speak. But the World Nobles, they do not understand love. To Saint Summers, it's curiosity, a human phenomena that tickles his mind brain. But love is a big problem for the world government because it is the only power source that they are not capable of harnessing. They can exert their willpower and manifest Haki. They can consume devil fruits and wield the dreams of humanity. They can commandeer an army of pacifists and turn them into a legion of war. And they can even steal an ancient weapon and put it to work doing, well, I'm not actually sure what it's doing because every island it's ever targeted never existed in the first place. But the power of love is something they could never take. And even worse, they could never corrupt or erase it because, mate, they have tried and failed miserably. Big man Bartholomew Kuma is our proof of this, and his demonstration of love left even Dr. Vegapunk in complete scientific and spiritual bewilderment. After Kuma's shell arrived at Egghead Island to save Bonnie, Vegapunk had an epiphany, a once-in-a-lifetime breakthrough, and he said to himself, "I attached a total shutdown switch to you, and now that it's been thrown, you should have been in a total vegetative state, without the ability to act of your own free will or even carry out orders. There's no reason he should have sprung into motion, and no logical scientific basis for his arrival at this island where Bonnie is. So is it true then? Is it not the physical strength of the Buccaneers that makes them remarkable? For at one point in time, we don't know, because then Vegapunk gets cut off before he can drop that big lore bombshell. But this inner monologue is very revealing because it's actually kind of indirectly referencing Haki. In the One Piece world, there is this primary focus on willpower, which is to be expected because any character can literally manifest their own will into an assortment of superhuman abilities. And so Saint Saturn's directions to Vegapunk were to strip Kuma of his willpower, thinking that that would completely deplete him of any ability in this world. And when Egghead was being published weekly, I believe I was guilty of the willpower misconception. Watching Kuma make his way to Egghead Island felt like another classic case of raw drive and willpower getting him there, very One Piece push through the pain. But Vegapunk is definitely hinting at something else. Because Kuma has no will of his own. It was taken away. However, what Saint Saturn, the world government as a whole, and even Dr. Vegapunk may have neglected is the power of love. Something that we've explored many examples of in this video already, and a lot of those examples could be mistaken for willpower, but Bartholomew Kuma is about as close as we can get to objective proof that love can be used as an individual power source all on its own. It's something currently beyond the understanding of science, not just by Saturn, not just by Judge, but even by Vegapunk, who didn't even conceive of the idea until moments before his death. And what's really interesting to me is that while the world nobles can't grasp love, that may not necessarily be true of Imu himself. In fact, it almost certainly isn't, given how we've seen Imu pine over his portrait of Nefertari D. Lily and his subsequent obsession with Vivi. And it may well be the case that the entire last 800 years of the One Piece world have been dictated by Imu's love for Lily, making it the most powerful and influential source on the planet, but not for very good reasons. And so it makes a lot of thematic sense that Imu is connected with the idea of the Abyss, because Abyss is just a fancy way of saying limitless emptiness, and perhaps that is exactly what Imu is without love. He is an empty, silhouetted shell, and should the power of love be real, then it would be very thematically appropriate for it to be a potential counter to Abyss-related abilities. Hence why Scopa-Gaban may be able to do stuff like slice the arm off Saint Summers and it not regenerating, or at least it hasn't regenerated at the time of of recording this video. And that would be pretty exciting because it would mean that Sanji is the Straw Hat in the greatest position to take on the Holy Knights, but also depending on Brook's connection to Gunko, there may be a love thread developing there as well, which brings us to Boa Hancock. You'll see why that makes sense in a bit. Because what makes me very unsure about this topic is that sure, the power of love is a fantastic ability for Sanji to wield, but it doesn't at face value seem like a good natural fit for Luffy. And assumedly, Luffy will need to counter this abyss power at some stage. Even if we significantly widen the definition of love to something beyond a connection to another person, let's say the love of adventure, the love of freedom, or the love of other broad concepts, even then I'm still not sure if it feels right for Luffy. Although maybe it is, and there'll be some cool panels in the future of Luffy using his grandfather's fist of love. But even if Luffy never wields it himself, it has and will continue to be used in his favor, hence Boa Hancock. With love sickness being a very real condition in the One Piece world which can genuinely result in death, and Luffy has strongly benefited from the power of love afflicting Boa Hancock, with former Empress Gloriosa describing it as, "This is a stroke of luck. Monkey D. Luffy. Will he be the one to move this mountain?" Implying that love is the only force in this world that could have broken through Boa Hancock's sheer stubbornness, her willpower, her haki. And Gloriosa also used a common phrase from East Blue being, "Love is always a hurricane," which I've always found interesting because it sounds very similar to the idea of the will of D always causing a storm. The will of D being another one of those intangible abilities in the One Piece world. It can't, or at least so far, it hasn't been quantified or harnessed, but it is a power that certainly exists. And with love, this does seem to be an enduring motif for the final saga of One Piece. It has never been in more focus than on Egghead Island with Bonnie and Kuma, and on Elbaf with everyone, all of its residents. And I do have a theory for why this is. I think it may be because this is the final run for One Piece. The last opportunity that Oda will have a stage this large to say something important to him. And One Piece is now about leaving a legacy for the future. Oda started drawing the series as a teenager, and he will be concluding it as the father of two adults. Oda started writing this manga in the position of Luffy, as the young man setting out on a grand adventure, but he's concluding it in the position of a parent, a mentor in the One Piece world. Soon, Oda's generation will be moving on, and it'll be time for his children to begin inheriting and shaping the world. And that is reflected in One Piece with our focus on the generation to come after Luffy. Luffy's adventure has yet to conclude, but we are getting real close, and soon it will be time to pass that torch, with one major message for the final saga and a message of hope for the future being that love conquers all. When Monkey D. Sun God defeated Doflamingo on Dressrosa, the final attack he had to face was the very curiously named 16 Holy Bullets, and it consisted of Doflamingo firing off exactly 16 strings at Luffy, who went all Neo in the Matrix, stopping them with a single hand, and then smacked Doflamingo to the cold ground below. When I was reading this weekly at the time, I remember vividly thinking that this was a bit of an underwhelming final attack from Mr. Sir Flamingo. Usually the last thing we see from a major antagonist villain man is their big old ultimate super attack of doom, but these 16 string things felt more like an opening attack than it did a big finisher. And it would take 170 chapters and 7 years of real world publishing time for us, or maybe just for me, as readers, to understand the true significance of Doflamingo's attack. As in chapter 1060, Leloucia Kingdom was bombarded by the ancient weapon Uranus, which consisted of exactly 16 pillars of purging light. 16 holy bullets, if you will. Bullets that were decreed from above and shot in the exact same way that Doflamingo's strings were. So we need to answer 3 questions. Firstly, what is the significance of the number 16? Has it appeared elsewhere in the series? And mate, let me tell you, this turned out to be a far deeper rabbit hole than I was initially prepared for. But secondly, why was Doflamingo replicating the attack of an ancient weapon, and how aware of Uranus is he? The answer to that one's going to make you feel a bit uncomfortable, because he is very aware of it. And finally, how much does Doflamingo know about Imu, and how was he planning to use Imu to attain his goal of something world domination? Lots to do, and I generally try not to dive too deeply into ideas that only have 1 or 2 points of evidence, because 2 is just a coincidence, especially in a series as long and as large as One Piece, but 3 is a pattern, and anything more than 3 is excessively beating you over the head to get your attention. attention. So we have our 16 holy bullets of Doflamingo, the 16 shots of Uranus, but we also have Luffy ringing the ox bell at Marineford 16 times according to world government tradition, and even a civilian in chapter 763 stated that a world noble shot his sons a total of 16 times for the crime of walking across their path, which took place in Doflamingo's flashback, by the way. So that's already 4, and this next one, it's a bit of a stretch, but I thought I'd include it anyway for reasons that will shortly become clear. But when Mr. St. Charlos enters the human auction house on Sabri, he very conveniently does so with the announcement of entry number 16. You might think I'm crazy for bringing that one up, but mate, I am about to take you on a journey of belief, because even without that, there is a confirmed connection and meaning behind the number 16 in world noble culture. And whenever numbers become significant in One Piece, the first place to look for meaning is usually in Buddhism. Zoro tends to be a great example of this. Whenever he mentions a number like a 108-pound phoenix or 3,000 worlds, those numbers generally hold great meaning in Buddhist spirituality and cosmology. And Buddhism, I should say, is directly connected to Imu. Imu's name is written in the katakana I and Mu, which I will say can also be read as 1 and 6 thanks to Gorowase, very much in keeping with the 16 theming. But when the symbols of Imu's name are put together, they actually form this one very curious kanji, which has 2 meanings. The first and most recognized reading is Hotoke, meaning Buddha, so it makes sense to look to Buddhism initially to find the answer here. And one very curious concept is known as the 16 mental defilements, which are conditions of the mind that require purification, although I guess in the case of world nobles, these are the 16 principles by which they lead their lives, which include greed, malice, contempt, jealousy, hypocrisy, vanity, haughtiness, and a lot of other not so great things that come together to form 16. It really is quite interesting to look at the full list of these mental defilements and see that putting all of those together ends up crafting the perfect world noble. But 16 actually has a much greater significance. Remembering that the kanji that Imu's name constructs has 2 meanings, and now just stick with me here and remember that I, man on the internet, did not invent Japanese, and I don't know why what I'm about to say is a thing, but this kanji, which can be read as Buddha, can also be read as France, where 16 is a very significant number, with Louis XVI being the last king of France prior to the French Revolution, which is very much in keeping with Imu, as he is assumedly going to be the last king of the world government before the global One Piece world revolution. As a point of semantic order, I know that Louis XVI wasn't the last king. That's why I said the last one before the revolution. But there comes a certain point where I don't know how much of this is intentional and how much is coincidence. I just know that the how much is a lot. And I also know that Oda tends to pay very, very careful attention to puns. So I can see him taking this kanji and creating a character that inhabits both of its meanings. A wise, twisted Buddha-esque being that also involves something France. I actually shouldn't be so flippant about the French connection because there's quite a bit more to this. To go back to Louis XVI, one of the reasons why he was overthrown and executed was due to the starvation of his people, which occurred primarily due to a very severe winter, which decimated their food reserves. And that's very similar to the world nobles of Marijois currently experiencing a famine thanks to the Revolutionary Army, the leader of which is something of a weather phenomenon himself. And in addition to that, Louis decided that one of the main solutions to this starvation problem would be to heavily increase taxes on the poorest people, in much the same way that the world government demands a heavenly tribute from all of its affiliated nations. And crazily enough, that didn't work out too well for Louis. And I have talked about world nobles being based specifically on French monarchs in other videos before, which I think holds up because Pangaea Castle itself is modeled after Chateau de Chambord, which was built as a, what passed for the French definition of modest, hunting lodge, with hunting being a pretty large aspect of world noble culture, or at least it was up until the God Valley incident. And in chapter 1086, we had the introduction of Mr. St. Vigeland Garling, but whilst this was going on, the world nobles were complaining in the background about their food options, saying, "We have no food, no bread, only cake to eat," which is almost certainly a reference to Marie Antoinette's Let Them Eat Cake, with Marie Antoinette, of course, being the wife of King Louis XVI. So look, I'm usually pretty skeptical about this number stuff, but I genuinely think that there's something here. I feel that Oda is trying to portray Marijois as the final days before the French Revolution, or at least heavily using it as inspiration. And if he keeps going in this direction, what we'll need is some sort of Napoleon to rise up, and if that were to happen, my eyes would be looking in the general direction of Vigeland Garling. But that is an idea for another time. For now, I think that the number 16 is a combination of meaning. Spawned from Imu's name, which can be read as 1 and 6, but also Buddha and France, and so a world noble firing a 16-bullet attack and really holding this number 16 to great esteem means embracing the 16 mental defilements that characterize them, as well as represents the proliferation of a society on the brink of revolution. It could also be other things that we aren't yet aware of, such as perhaps Imu being the 16th king out of the 20 to form the original World Government Alliance. It could even be a reference to Imperial Japan, as their rising sun flag had 16 red rays of sun emerging from it, and it is seen as a symbol of war, which ties into the theorized depiction of Pluton on the moon during NL's cover story, as that sun had 16 points, and even the ancient weapon Poseidon, which was properly awakened by Shirahoshi when she was 16 years old. And to add to all of that, Uranus was first used in chapter 1060, and if you take away those pesky zeros, there is that nasty number 16 again. Lots of 16, lots of weapons, and lots of war, and so the meaning of the number 16 could just be all of the above. 16 is a bad number. And in fact, what I've really learned from making this video is that the number 16 is the only one in all of existence that could describe a world noble culture so well. So when stuff happens like Charlos entering the auction house with the announcement of number 16, it really would not surprise me if that was extremely intentional and almost like the announcer of fate heralding the arrival of a world noble. And when it comes to Uranus specifically, we have a very curious case, because the ancient weapons, at least as far as we know, were not created by the world government. We know for a fact that Pluton wasn't, that was built on Water 7, and Poseidon is more of an inherited ability, but Uranus was powered by the Mother Flame, which was not a technology that the world government had access to. And given that fact, it feels more likely that Imu elected to have it fire exactly 16 times as part of their symbology. The weapon itself is probably capable of firing more or less than that. In fact, I would say that 16 shots is probably overkill. Like shooting 16 bullets into that dude's kid, it can be seen as complete and unambiguous eradication. And one question that we've had to grapple with ever since the introduction of Imu is, do the world nobles themselves know about him? Do they know that when they put the number 16 on a pedestal, they've literally placed some dude with the number 16 on a big chair? And I'd have to say the answer to that is almost certainly not, because that would mean recognizing a god above themselves, and I just don't think they're mentally capable of it. And I think that if they did, Imu would have become common knowledge since long before now, if only due to the more moral world nobles like Saint Humming and Saint Mosgard, who could have spread the word. But they had no idea. However, Doflamingo is a different case entirely. If you were to ask the world's greatest gateway to knowledge, Google, if Doflamingo knows about Imu, then it answers the following: yes, the character of Doflamingo in One Piece knows about Imu, the leader of the world government. Doflamingo was even revealed to have been interacting with Imu directly. And I do feel it's very important that right below that, it has the disclaimer that AI responses may include mistakes. Good disclaimer, because that's a pretty big mistake there. Doflamingo has never been shown interacting directly with Imu. However, it is heavily hinted that Doflamingo has seen Imu before, or at the very least knows about Imu. In chapter 906, we get to visit Doflamingo in Impel Down, who's having a surprisingly good time despite his conditions, and he spends a few panels musing about his incoming assassination. Why the solitary cell, huh? A guy could get lonely down here. Or is this meant to protect me, Magellan? Have they come for me, an assassin from above, to make sure that I don't go spilling the secrets of Marijoi's hidden treasure? A hired killer to silence me for good, eh? He. Just let the secret out. Power has such a short shelf life. It goes bad very quickly. And it's after this monologue that we cut to Marijois and we see Imu for the very first time, carrying Luffy's bounty and opening a very frosty vault containing the enigma that is the giant straw hat, which could imply by juxtaposition that Doflamingo was talking about Imu as the treasure. But this is not the first time that Doflamingo spoke about this hidden treasure. And very importantly, he always seems to have a different adjective to describe it. Here, it was a hidden treasure, but previously he's also called it a crucial treasure and a national treasure. And the assumption has mostly been that Doflamingo was referring to an object, with the two leading ideas on that being either the massive straw hat or the ancient weapon Uranus itself. However, as stated before, I believe that Doflamingo may have been referring to Imu, and it's because he describes this treasure as follows: it's because I know about a crucial treasure that exists within sacred Marijois, and the very fact of its existence would shake the world to its foundations. And that's not something I believe that the giant straw hat could currently do, unless, say, it has a massive amount of Joy Boy hockey infused into it and basically acts as a giant global hockey bomb. But other than that, should it be revealed, not enough people really understand the significance of a straw hat for it to deal any damage. Not even we as readers truly truly understand what this hat means at this stage. And it really doesn't fit with the second part of Doflamingo's statement, which was about obtaining Trafalgar Law's Devil Fruit. At a currently unknown point in time, Doflamingo returned to the Holy Land of Marijois, which is where he discovered this treasure, and he was relentlessly hunted down as a result, but Doflamingo was able to slither his way out like a well-lubed otter, and he stated, "If only I'd had the power of the Op-Op fruit in my grasp on that specific day years ago, I would have been able to make use of that Marijois treasure to seize the world." That is how valuable and useful those powers are, not only for the personality switching surgery, but one ability even greater. So the Straw Hat doesn't really fit that criteria. If Doflamingo has Law's Devil Fruit powers, and I don't know, the hat, I guess it's stylish. And Doflamingo is a man known for making bold fashion choices. But I would say that the ancient weapon Uranus doesn't fit what he was talking about either. Even if Doflamingo managed to discover that the world government was in possession of Uranus, he has no way to power it without the Mother Flame, and having Trafalgar Law's Devil Fruit doesn't change that in any way. Although things do get slightly more complicated here because Doflamingo is implied to have some understanding of Uranus as well, not just because of his tribute attack that looks exactly how Uranus functions, but because after the rise of global sea levels, Doflamingo says to Magellan that most cities in this world would be wiped out with an extra 5 meters of water, and he then suggests that they should move to higher ground. Almost as if he knew exactly what caused this rise in sea level. It wasn't a natural phenomena, and it was probably going to happen at least 5 more times. 5 meters is just 5 more shots. Somehow Doflamingo, he knows this, or he has a sense of this. But look, even if he did want Uranus, even if that was the main goal, there is a much easier way to get it. Because Trafalgar Law's Devil Fruit would have given Doflamingo instant dominion over the entire planet if he'd been able to switch personalities with Emu. After that point, Uranus would have come under his domain by default, as well as the suspected immortality possessed by Emu's body. And having seen Emu is probably why Doflamingo is so confident that this surgery even works to begin with, because he has seen at least one example of an immortal being. And there's no doubt that Doflamingo seeks to sit on the empty throne, or at least create a new world with him in the equivalent position after purging the Otherworld nobles, because in chapter 782 we are given this panel of Doflamingo and his 4 executive officers bowing towards him, with Doflamingo standing atop a pile of rubble. And if you think this panel looks familiar, it's not just because you read it and you've seen it once, it's because Oda deliberately reused this composition for another much more iconic panel later on, which was chapter 908, where the 5 elders are bowing to Emu in the same position, replicated right down to the smallest, teeny tiniest of details, such as having 2 speech bubbles flanking Emu filled with dedicated words to serve as his wings, and even very minor things like the walking stick of Saint Saturn and the sword of Ethan Baron Venus Duro being in the same position as Treble Staff and Diamante Sword in the original panel. What's happening here is not a coincidence. Oda drew Doflamingo and Emu very intentionally to parallel one another, and it's only in retrospect that we really understand how horrifyingly high Doflamingo's ambition was. If there was ever a point in history where Emu was a human rather than a dark silhouette creature, I could very much imagine him having an extremely similar personality and drive to Doflamingo. But there is also a common misconception with Doflamingo's motives that he was referring to the perpetual youth surgery and effective immortality as the mechanism to use in combination with the national treasure that would have allowed him to seize the world. However, Doflamingo never actually clarifies which aspect of Law's Devil Fruit he had in mind for that specific day, and he does mention both the perpetual youth surgery and the personality switching, so it could be either. And the reason why this gets slightly confusing is because this is Doflamingo's hypothetical. If he had that power on that day, then this, but that's not necessarily his plan that he's working towards on Dressrosa. After discovering that Law had eaten the Op-Op fruit, Doflamingo stated that he'd need to make sure to raise Law to die for his sake, which implies performing the surgery, but not necessarily because all of the Don Quixote family are branded with this mentality, and in fact Doflamingo even made this exact request to both Virgo and Monet on Punk Hazard. He asked them to die for his sake. So it's frustratingly unclear, but look, the Occam's razor here, the simplest answer is that Doflamingo did want to use Law to attain the perpetual youth surgery, but also he's a complicated guy and his exact plan is never revealed. It's just something world domination. And I think the reason for that vagueness is because this plan involves Emu, a being that Doflamingo almost certainly knows about, and one that would be very problematic to overcome even if Doflamingo was to attain perpetual youth. Not aging is one thing, but the surgery of the Op-Op fruit would not grant Doflamingo the regenerative abilities that the Abyss does. So the easiest thing from my perspective would be to have a trusty subordinate consume the op-op fruit and use it to switch Doflamingo and Imu's bodies. And in that case, it would be entirely possible that the 5 elders, even if they knew about this, would be forced to serve Imu Flamingo because his abilities can kill them with a single snap of a silhouetted finger. And should Doflamingo ever be released from Impel Down, there is every chance that he would resume this nefarious plan. Calico Yorkie is alive. That's right, you thought it was death, but it was me, life. And we're going to go over Oda's original plan for Yorkie, as well as how and why that changed, how it fits into Brook's secret history at a certain kingdom, how Yorkie survived, and his connection to Jewelry Bonnie, as well as other things, so many other things. This is a much longer video than I anticipated it would be because I keep finding stuff. But the idea that Yorkie may have survived is not a new one. In fact, pretty much the only time that anyone talks about Calico Yorkie is in regards to his potential survival, which has resulted in every possible incarnation of thought being processed, including 11 years ago on Reddit when there was a particularly wild theory that Yorkie was actually Admiral Green Bull and that Brook would have some sort of relationship to all Marine Admirals due to the rampant speculation that he is also Kuzan's grandfather or something along those lines. And we've also heard crazy ideas that Yorkie's ship was destroyed by a Sea King he washed up on Amazon Lily, and that's where Gloriosa fell in love with him and why she betrayed the Kuja tribe by leaving the island to join the Rocks Pirates with the purpose of searching for Yorkie. Every theory that can be posed has been posed. And up until now, I've mostly been in the camp that this boy is dead, and that Oda wanted to give him more of an artistic hero's farewell rather than see him die in excruciating pain, coughing and spluttering until death. However, Robin's reunion with one Jaguar D Sol has changed my thinking of this because deaths are no longer up for artistic interpretation. We live in an age where we need to see them bodies. And in addition to this, the reappearance of Gin with Don Krieg also reinforces my thinking, because Gin was in a very similar position to Yorkie. Gin was poisoned and pretty much guaranteed to die, so he heroically set off into the distance, never to be seen again until he was. So I can't bring myself to accept Yorkie's death at face value anymore. There's no guarantees. And Yorkie is an often forgotten about but very intriguing existence because he's one of Oda's earliest characters, appearing way back in chapter 103, with his eventual exploration delivering a brash, lovable protagonist of his own story, with characters on his face that strongly resemble the Japanese katakana yo, but arguably also look like the tail of a musical note. And Yorkie also has a surprise connection to a certain Jewelry Bonnie. Yorkie's full name is often mistaken as Calico Yorkie, an error that I myself have made in the past, but the Calico part is actually his epithet, and it's a name inspired by the real-life pirate Calico Jack, who got that epithet due to his preference for calico clothing, which gives 18th century piracy a distinctly RuPaul's Drag Race vibe. Now, Calico Jack had an affair with Anne Bonny, the inspiration for Jewelry Bonnie, and at one point this affair, mate, it got so steamy that Jack offered to buy Bonnie in a practice described as divorce by purchase. However, her husband refused. But then Bonnie just up and ran away with Jack for free, which, bargain. But as a result of this, there used to be a very prominent theory that this connection was kept in mind by Oda, and that the two had crossed paths at some point, with Bonnie making Yorkie young again through her Devil Fruit abilities. However, we've since learned that Bonnie's abilities are permanently temporary and highly subject to her own imagination and belief. So that connection is down the toilet, but Yorkie's death was left extremely vague. On one of his voyages, Yorkie contracted a disease that looks suspiciously like the tree fever encountered by Noland on Jaya, and it's even been said that Yorkie caught it after exploring a forest-type thing, with the crew doctor stating they must have contracted it in the jungle they stopped by. I've never seen anything like it. None of my treatments work. Although if it was a jungle, then it also sounds similar to Nami's 5-day disease, which she picked up on Little Garden. I doubt that it is the 5-day disease, but that case may explain why the Rumbar Pirates doctor had no cure for Yorkie's condition. In the case of 5-day disease, Nami was fatefully lucky that Dr. Kureha had lived long enough to predate the reported eradication of the disease, so she still had a supply of vaccine available just in case. But if it was tree fever, which is much more likely, then that was a condition 400 years ago. And if it was thought to be eradicated sometime between then and now, then modern fictional doctors would not be equipped to treat it, because the cure is oddly specific. You need to source a special substance known as konin from kona trees. And even if you know what disease you're fighting and how to treat it, then you'd still need to know where to find a kona tree before this disease kills Yorkie and all of the other crew members. However, the fact that it is possible means that Yorkie could have survived, no matter how slim those those chances are. But the condition itself was not the only challenge he faced for survival, because Yorkie also took the infected portion of the Rumbar Pirates and tried to escape the Grand Line by sailing through the Calm Belt. And some of Yorkie's last words were, "We can't risk the infection spreading. The rest of the crew and I will try to exit the Grand Line via the Calm Belt. We're not giving up yet." Now again, I've generally weighed in more on the side of this being a romantic portrayal of death. Oda literally shows us Yorkie sailing off into the sunset, never to be seen again. But I also thought the same thing about Saul. As much as his death was never viscerally depicted, it seems like another romantic take on the end of a man's life. So with Saul and the aforementioned Geen surviving, this does throw Yorkie into question for me. And he's not the only one either, because there's a couple of other key flashback characters that we don't see die but have been assumed to be dead, like Tom. The last shot we see of him is a close-up being taken away on the sea train, and he was then presumably executed at any slobby ? I don't know, who knows? We don't see anything like a newspaper article announcing his death, it's all just assumptions. And just like Saul, there has been some controversy over whether or not to have Tom in the dead category of the One Piece wiki, and if you go to the ever so reliable talk section, then you'll see that an editor named Galaxy 9000 has posed the question of whether or not we know for a fact that Tom's dead, which I've discovered is the best way to start a fight on the One Piece wiki, because after this, another editor named Dance Powder snapped back with, "We have confirmed this. He was either executed as ordered or bled out beforehand. Please don't turn this into another Sabo fiasco. Frankie and Iceberg both said he was dead, and there is nothing to suggest otherwise." And at this point, I'd argue that there's almost equally as little to suggest that he is actually dead. It's all assumptions, and neither Frankie nor Iceberg are reliable narrators. Because if you'd asked Robin whether or not Saul was dead, she would have said, "Yep, saw the dude get frozen myself." But back to Yorkie, the fact that even at the very end he wasn't giving up is a big point in his favor. Because One Piece is a series about willpower that can be quantified into actual fist-punching power. And right before departing, Brook also says that this doesn't have to be the end and that they'll reunite again. So both Brook and Yorkie had the will to make this happen. They refused to say goodbye. And we only know how one half of that story turned out, with Crocus alleging to know the second half. "Those pirates who left you in my care have fled the Grand Line. I know they were your friends and they made you a promise, but they're never coming back." Which was information that Crocus hadn't discovered firsthand. No, this comes from his quote, "reliable source." But if Crocus didn't see it himself, then this conclusion is still questionable, and Crocus goes on to say that, "I'm afraid reality is even crueler than fiction." And to that I say, luckily for us, this pirate comic is fiction. And Oda will often deliberately cut back on cruelty because he has that power as an author. And so here I think that one of two things happened. What you're looking at on screen right now is what I call the Straw Hat Blueprint. This was a guide sketch that Oda did for the crew composition when the series began. This was made as a guiding star and one that got derailed pretty quickly. I mean, just look at Usopp, what's happening here? But this blueprint provides us with fantastic insight into Oda's goals. And if we look at his guiding star for Brook, what we see is a funky cowboy skeleton, which is likely the reason why Yorkie and half the Rumbar Pirates retain that cowboy aesthetic. And so it's very possible that the figure from chapter 103 that we see and now know as Yorkie was originally supposed to be Brook, because his face is deliberately masked, at least in the manga. In the anime, they kept nothing vague at all and even gave us a very detailed close-up of his face, which doesn't look unlike Oda's final Yorkie design and may even have been the inspiration of continuity for it. But back at the time that Oda was drawing chapter 103, I think it's very possible that the character he drew was Brook, because the actual Brook is nowhere to be seen. And if there was a different intention for him, then he should be somewhere in the background of the Rumbar Pirates panels in chapter 103. And when we do get to Thriller Bark, these background panels are shown again, but they have been retconned to show Brook standing smack bang in the middle. So somewhere along the line, Oda made the choice to separate Brook from this drawn entity. And one explanation for that is that Yorkie has a greater purpose to fulfill down the line. Oda had a better idea of how to use this setup, and so he created Yorkie to plant another seed, and so he may very well be someone that we encounter again in the future. The other explanation is what I'm going to call the more pessimistically real one, which is that there was no real plan, ever. Just because we knew that Brook existed in Oda's mind from the beginning doesn't mean that Laboon and the Rumbar Pirates were always meant to be his setup. For all we know, these guys in chapter 103 were never meant to be named or referenced ever again. They were just props, warm, fleshy props to tell a sad whale story story that Oda went on to recycle and repurpose later on. And that's why Yorkie had to exist, because Oda needed to link Brook to Laboon, but also make sense of what Crocus originally said about the crew fleeing the Grand Line. And the only way to do that was to basically create two crews, then have one half fulfill the original Crocus continuity, and have the other implement the tragic yet beautiful ideas that Oda thought up later for Thriller Bark. I believe that's the most likely explanation, because I think that Oda gets far too much credit for foreshadowing and nowhere near enough credit for improvising. His real skill is improvising, using the pieces that he sort of haphazardly put on the board in ways that he never could have dreamed of at the time. And that's a big part of why the Yorkie being alive theory still works for me, because even if this guy was meant to be a functional, expendable character 2 times over now, Oda has still left room for Yorkie to be back should that inspiration strike at just the right moment. And it's not just Yorkie that's been left wide open as if Eiichiro Oda grew up in a barn, because there is also a gaping chasm in Brook's backstory just waiting to be filled, as Brook has a secret history prior to the Rumbar Pirates that has only been mentioned once. Long ago, I was the leader of a battle convoy in a certain kingdom. After that, I served with the Rumbar Pirates as a musician swordsman and later stepped in as the captain. So before he was a pirate, Brook was a soldier. In fact, he had a whole career as a soldier on a quote, certain kingdom, and saying certain kingdom is a lot like when Oda says that man. It generally means that this is too important to spoil, so we're going to keep it vague. And the current leading hypothesis on this certain kingdom is that it's called Taroa, a region of West Blue, it just so happens to be where Brook and all of the Rumbar Pirates are from. But also, this man who you may or may not remember from the Human Auction House, his name is Byron, and he was being sold for his phenomenal skills as a musician. And not only that, but Byron was said to have been from a long line of musicians that hail from the Taroa kingdom. And the starting bid for Byron was the quote, a special price of 480,000 berries, which is the equivalent of 48 Doskoi Panda t-shirts, which isn't bad. Doskoi Panda is a luxury brand in the One Piece world after all. But A Kingdom of Music struck many people as quite interesting back in the day, simply because of how heavily Luffy himself focuses on music. Getting a musician was his #1 priority as a crew member long before the essential to stay alive roles, and this idea has only continued to grow over the years, with the advent of the Drums of Liberation and the ever-growing relevance of Bing Sasake, which was Yorkie's favorite song. And going back to Byron, his clothing very much resembles Brook's as well as half of the Rumbar Pirates, because that crew had a very stark complementary aesthetic going on, with half of them dressed like classical musicians and the other half dressed like cowfolk. It's not just music and aesthetics that we have to make this connection though, because there's also a third thing, a thing so ridiculous, which is this color spread of Brook playing music with a bunch of grasshoppers, except you fool, they're not grasshoppers, they are leafhoppers, and a particular genus of this leafhopper in question is known as a Taroa. And as far as we're aware, the Taroa in the Taroa kingdom is not referring to a Japanese word, because it's written in katakana, meaning that it's a loan word. The Japanese, they stole it. They came into your house, they stole your word. And look, I'm willing to accept that this is a wild coincidence and that Oda has never even heard of the Taroa before, but also the man is an avid zoologist and is infinitely curious about the world around him, so I wouldn't put it past Oda. And in addition to the clothing and the focus on music, that is 3 things, and 3 is the amount of connections that I personally require to start taking ideas somewhat seriously. All of the leaf hoppers in this color spread also have Brook's Jolly Roger on their hats, and they're performing in their own little leaf hopper kingdom. Again, this could be utter madness, but the fact is that we are missing a very key part of Brook's history, which is what inspired him to become a pirate in the first place. That's a pretty big question. We know why everyone else became pirates, and other Straw Hats do have unanswered questions, but they mostly revolve around parents. Who are Nami's true parents? Who are Frankie's true parents? Could be Queen. But all those questions can afford to go unanswered due to the found focus family of the series. But Brook is in a very different situation. There is no other Straw Hat who has a Void Century style blackout in their personal history, and to get all the way back to the point of this video, exploring that gap may be why Yorkie is being kept in the oven and narratively slow cooked to perfection for the eventual Brook banquet that our story stomachs demand. And a lot of the questions surrounding Yorkie's survival tend to revolve around logistics. How did he sail through the Calm Belt safely? How did the disease not kill him? How did it get cured? Who cured it? Why? But stuff like this is all pretty irrelevant. If we're talking about real life history, then sure, this matters a lot. You gotta think about these things things logically, but Oda can come up with pretty much anything to satisfactorily explain these sorts of things. Again, he's a ridiculously good improviser, and there's only a handful of cases where these gap-filling explanations have been unsatisfactory to me. And even if they are unsatisfactory. For example, for me personally, Sabo's amnesia is a pretty weak explanation for not knowing about Ace and Luffy and being alive at the same time. But it doesn't matter because weakness aside, Oda still did it. So even if the logistics are a bit shaky, that's not going to stop Yorkie or quite frankly anyone surviving if that's what Oda wants, which is the sort of thinking that I try to impart in these videos. You can't afford to think of fictional pirates in logical ways. You've got to think more emotionally, which is why the more important question I have, and I think this is much harder to answer, is if Yorkie is alive, then why didn't he go and visit Laboon? I think that's definitely much harder to answer than logistics. And if he did survive, then right now Yorkie would likely be about the same age as Brook, which is 90, which yes, does sound quite old, but according to Oda, the average human in the One Piece world lives to around 140, so it's not out of the question statistically. But in all of that time, in these past 52 years, like, go and see your whale friend. It's fine to not go and see Brook because, you thought he was dead for half a century, but Laboon is still there. Unless what happened to Yorkie was a fate similar to that of Brook. And Yorkie's path to survival could have seen him stranded and stuck somewhere for the last 50 years like Brook was. Yorkie could have been, or even is currently on an isolated island in the Calm Belt with no way of escaping, because even if you could build a ship or have your old ship, it's not like you can actually sail it in the Calm Belt. No wind, mate. Or the other option is that Yorkie could have been very active, and this could be a very One Piece solution, which is that Yorkie refused to go and see Laboon until he could reunite with Brook to properly fulfill their promise, or some sort of, emotional crap like that. Oda's very good at writing that sort of stuff and making it hit hard. I am not. And just like Robin and Saul, I think it would go down pretty well with the readers. In fact, it may even go over a lot better. Yorkie being alive is okay because the rest of the Ranma pirates, mate, they are definitely dead. We've seen their remains quite vividly as well, so the flashback doesn't lose anything. And just briefly on the remains of the Ranma pirates, something morbidly hilarious is that it's always played as a gag that Brook still has his hair because the afro is very firmly rooted, but he isn't even the only member of the Ranma pirates who kept his hair after death. There was also a member named Mizuka Madaisuke who wanted Brook to teach him how to use swords, and when Brook depressingly stumbles upon his body, it is seen with a sword jammed through the skull. Very poetic and such, dying by the thing it is that he wanted to do. Peak fiction. And it's also a shot that got censored in the anime to a stab in the back because the sword in the skull was deemed a bit too visceral. There are people on the internet who insist that the One Piece anime has no censorship, and if you're people, then you're wrong. In any case, Brook picks up Madaisuke's head, and would you look at that, it still has an almost full head of hair. And then there's a shot of all the Ranma pirate skulls being collected and piled up, and I know it's a depressing as crap flashback, but it always makes me laugh just a little bit to see Madaisuke's skull in the bottom right hand corner with that full head of hair. And also his name, Madaisuke, literally means I like dots, and it's why he wears a dotted shirt. And he also had a twin brother named Mizuta Mawariyotsuki, which means dots aren't bad, and he also wore a dotted shirt. There are people on the internet who insist that One Piece isn't a goofy pirate comic, and if you're people, then you're wrong. But as it is, Yorkie being alive might be too much to hope. Even if at any point Oda did have something in the works for this, it is possible that these ideas will be cut or streamlined for the final saga of One Piece. However, at the very least, I wouldn't count out a possible epilogue appearance by a very familiar Yorkie-esque face seeing an article about Brook, musician of the Pirate King, and set sail to reunite with his lost friend of half a century. Toei hates Sanji. There has been a concerted effort within Toei Animation to portray Sanji very differently in the One Piece anime than he has been in the manga, which has resulted primarily in diminishing his strength, amping up his pervy qualities, and most crazily of all, deliberately making Zoro look cooler, ever so cooler, to make Sanji look worse by comparison. That is the theory that I'm seeing online, and have been seeing for quite some time now, particularly during the Egghead era of the anime, and I've mostly shrugged it off as the ramblings of Reddit and the tempestuousness of Twitter. That is until recently when I started really looking into it. And as it turns out, there is indeed a very consistent effort put into undermining Sanji's adaptation in the One Piece anime. Whether this is on purpose or not is a question that we will answer shortly. However, I can confirm that this effect is very much real. And as the most unbiased source on the internet, I have chosen myself to investigate this. Pay no attention to the other life-size Zoro in the background there. Look, unbiased people have life-size statues of characters they feel completely neutral about all the time. And if you have a problem with it, then I think that you are the biased one and you disgust me. But let's kick off with an example in episode 1046, which contained one of my favorite Wano moments, which is when Zoro and Sanji simultaneously kick and sword into action against King and Queen, whilst Marco says it's time for the stars to take the stage. I still genuinely get chills thinking about it. For the wings of the Pirate King to take flight and soar onto the world stage for the very first time, it's so good. However, if you watched the anime adaptation of this event, then you'll know that things were done a little bit differently. Right before Marco's line about the stars taking the stage, there is a slow, lingering shot of Zoro epicsomely emerging from his bandages, looking amazing as he always does. And then what Marco says is, "Here comes the star, singular. Here comes the singular star." After which point Zoro alone leaps over Marco to attack. Whereas in the manga, Zoro and Sanji both attack simultaneously. And what all of this does is make it look like Marco was just referring to Zoro. Here comes the star. And we're very much ignoring that Sanji is also there. Now, I do think that this is pretty egregious, but it's not entirely Toei's fault. The line in Japanese is the same in the manga as the anime, so the fault here does also lie with the English translator, because Japanese, it's a very tricksy language. It often doesn't differentiate between singular or plural, and so you need to understand exactly what the words are referring to by the context in which they are used. So for example, the Viz translator Stephen Paul, he understood that Marco was talking about both Zoro and Sanji, but the anime sub-translator clearly thought that it was just Zoro, star, singular, implying that they're probably not a One Piece manga reader. But also, it's really hard to blame them for translating it as star singular, because the entire scene as portrayed by Toei is all about hyping up Zoro. In the manga, Zoro and Sanji are given equal panel time in this moment, but in the anime, they linger on Zoro a lot, both before and after Marco's line. And the reason for this is because they need to add in filler material wherever possible, because the Toei anime only covers one chapter per episode, sometimes less, and without all of these little creative additions, episodes would probably only be about 12 minutes long, opening and ending included. So Toei objectively created the wrong impression of this scene, because even the person who was hired to translate it thought that the scene was all about Zoro. And it definitely does diminish this moment, which should be about both wings, but instead we're talking about a very lopsided bird because we're only focusing on one wing. And at this point, I imagine that a lot of people are watching this video and calling me some sort of pedantic man on the internet because this is a small thing, but in my opinion, it's a small thing that makes a big difference. And if it was just one small thing, I wouldn't even be making this video. But these micro decisions very consistently add up, and they add up not in Sanji's favor. So during Egghead Island, there was a need for filler in both Zoro and Sanji fights. In Zoro's case, that was Zoro versus S-Hawk, and for Sanji, it was his fight against S-Shark. His first fight, I should say, because there are multiple. And this is a very good case study because things are about as equal as we could hope. One wing of the Pirate King versus one seraph of the Seraphim. And in Zoro's case, the filler he's given is one of the most exquisitely crafted sequences in the entire history of the One Piece anime. It is so stunningly choreographed, expertly animated, and it makes Zoro look nothing less than phenomenal. Because not only does he take no damage, he's also got the handicap of carrying around Kaku, and he's doing it all so stylishly. It honestly makes Zoro look a lot more capable than I think he actually is, because S-Hawk, he's basically a mini Mihawk. This is an amazing feat, and it's not being performed by the man who's supposed to have amazing feet. Because if we take a look at Sanji's filler, where he gets choked out by S-Shark and thrown against a wall in a very not amazingly animated scene, this makes Sanji look a lot less capable than he actually is. Because in the manga, this scene does not exist. There is no point at which he struggles against S-Shark at all. He fights S-Shark twice, and he does very well in both encounters. And so I think this does display the general Toei mindset when it comes to these filler additions. Zoro is viewed as this grand showcase piece. Every morsel of Zoro filler is an opportunity to draw and animate something amazing. The animators are salivating over the opportunity, whereas Sanji is more of a ragdoll. He's what you get to do when you don't get the Zoro scene. So where Zoro exists to be enhanced, Sanji exists to be diminished. And this general Toei mindset was confirmed in the filler of 1124. To briefly explain the context of this for non-manga readers, there is an overnight time skip during Egghead Island, after which point we cut back to the Straw Hats having captured York and the Seraphim, and we never find out how exactly this happened. We just see the aftermath. To this day, we still have no idea what canonically happened during that evening, but the anime decided to go and fill in some of those gaps. What they did is they wrote their version of what happened during that night, and and they did so in a rather predictable way. What happened, according to Toei, is that Kaku found himself going up against two Seraphim, Esper and S-Hawk, and he had to be saved by Zoro, who swished in, beat both of them at once, and was very, very cool whilst doing it. Whereas according to Toei, what happened to Sanji is that he went up against one Seraphim, and he had to be saved by Nami. Not that there's anything wrong with being saved by Nami, but it is very interesting how Toei decided to write their version of these events, where Zoro's a smooth Giga Chad Alpha, easily taking on two Seraphim at once, while Sanji was forced to his knees by S-Shark, looking honestly quite pathetic in this still they made for him. This episode is actually what tipped me into the camp that maybe there is something to this Toei hates Sanji theory, because it does seem like they take every opportunity to make Zoro look better and make Sanji look worse. And it's not just action either, because Toei also heavily exaggerates Sanji's simp gags. For example, there's a scene in chapter 1075 where Sanji's all over Stussy, reminiscing about that time he met Stussy at his own wedding, and really probably should have had his eyes elsewhere on that of all days. But Sanji then goes full Sanji and asks Stussy if she will let him be her dog. And so with that in mind, I don't really know how much I can blame what Toei did here, because Oda did really give license for it. But in the manga, Stussy kind of shrugs this off with a laugh and gets everyone right back on task. And one difference with the anime is Sanji's dialogue. They add in an extra line where he says from the moment he saw Stussy, which again was on his own wedding day, he's been Stussy's servant. And after she says her line, Sanji starts acting like a literal dog with hard eyes, hopping and drooling and balking and performing all sorts of fun tricks. And stuff like this comes from the same core problem of the One Piece anime that I always bang on about, and I've already mentioned a couple of times in this video and will mention a couple of times again. It comes from a need for filler. Because the anime cannot fill 20-minute episodes with only a single chapter, they've got to look at each and every panel in that single chapter and think about how to extend all of the scenes. And in the case of this panel, they looked at it and thought, well, what if Sanji actually did start acting like a dog? And even though he's the one who suggested it in the manga, the anime does make him look slightly worse by having him actually do it. Although, to be fair, I don't think it's out of character for Sanji. If Stussy had said this in the manga, then he 100% would have done this, in my opinion. But there is one very recent anime filler scene that is very out of character. At the end of episode 1123, Sanji approached Jewelry Bonnie with a plate of pancakes, simping over her with his traditional heart eyes, which he does with every woman. But it's a bit of a weird moment because Jewelry Bonnie is actually 12 years old. Now, a couple of things about this. Firstly, this scene is not in the manga. Secondly, in Sanji's defense, he does not know that she's a child at this point. And realistically, I do think this is what he would do. Sanji sees woman, Sanji simps for woman. And in fact, when it was first confirmed that Bonnie was a child, the very first thought I had was, oh, Sanji, you, my boy, have made some very big mistakes. But then I looked back on every scene of Sanji and Bonnie interacting, and I noticed that he never once did his classic heart eye simp routine with her in any way. And that's because Eiichiro Oda, I imagine, was very well aware of what he was doing and probably didn't want to put Sanji in that situation of lusting after a child, even if she had an adult body. It's just, it's messy. It's so much easier to avoid the issue altogether. And so the in-world explanation is now that Sanji's natural radar filtered Bonnie out. He didn't know that she was a child, but his natural system did not recognize Bonnie as a target for physical affection. And so I think that Toei have done Sanji really dirty on two counts here. Firstly, because unlike us reading at the time, they know what's coming with Bonnie. And this is a scene that just didn't need to exist. It doesn't exist. They made it up. And so they made an active choice for Sanji to go into this lust mode. But our second count is that Oda made a conscious decision never to depict Sanji doing this with Bonnie. And so even if it does sound unrealistic, I do think that Toei have actively gone against the intentions of the author by making this filler scene. And it should be said that this is not the first time they've had Sanji do something like this in relation to a child as in filler. In One Piece Film Z, we had a reverse Bonnie situation where Nami was physically aged down by the powers of the Motomoto no Mi, and so she spent a lot of the film with the body of an 8-year-old, which the rest of the crew saw as a crisis, but Sanji, in his Winston Churchill wisdom of never wasting a crisis, saw this as an opportunity. He mused that this would mean he'd be able to, quote, closely observe Nami's precious days while her body matures, which is definitely the creepiest line in the entire One Piece franchise, and it was given to one of our core protagonists. And I should point out that this film was not written by Oda. Film Z was written by Osamu Suzuki, but I guess Oda didn't seem to have an issue with it. However, he is at the very least aware enough to keep that stuff out of the manga, but it does come out in the anime every now and then, and it's also what contributes to Sanji getting a bit of a raw deal in the anime. I think that manga Sanji would have grounds wants to sue Anime Sanji for defamation. That's when he's even on screen at all, that is. Because something that probably goes unnoticed by a lot of people, I guess intentionally, is how often Sanji just gets cut out of a shot that he was meant to be in. For example, there's an amazing panel right at the end of chapter 1089, where it is revealed that the crew have captured York and everyone's looking very cool, doing their own thing. Sanji's even in the background there, celebrating by serving food and making heart eyes, very notably in the exact opposite direction of Bonnie. And now let's look at the anime adaptation of this, and this, it's just funny. Because in the anime, Sanji's not even there at all. Look at the void between Monkey D. Luffy and Rob Lucci that Sanji's meant to be filling. The dude just got cut out of the group photo. Sanji is the only character that the anime deliberately cut out of this scene. And look, I get why this decision was probably made. It's because in the manga, it looks like Sanji's the only character in motion, whilst the others are mostly static. And so it would be the more cost-effective thing to do to cut out Sanji instead of animating him just for a background pass. I say cost-effective, not time-effective, because they took a 6-month break before this episode aired. So unlike almost every other episode, there was definitely time to put Sanji in at least. And there's also another thing that Sanji fans do get quite annoyed at. But bear with me because this one takes a bit of explaining. In chapter 1073, S-Shark shoots a laser beam at Edison, which explodes, and then we instantly cut to Sanji having saved Edison and leaving Zoro a bit confused at just how quickly Sanji managed to appear by his side. It's a pretty straightforward event, but the anime makes this weird. S-Shark shoots at Edison, things then explode, and then we have a filler scene where Franky saves Lilith, which is cool, definitely not complaining about more Franky action, but it takes a comically long time for them to land, and then even longer for Lilith to look back. We just sort of freeze on her face for a bit, and suddenly she goes, "Oh, Edison!" It takes so long for her to look back at the explosion and call out to Edison, and only after lingering on the debris for what feels like an eternity does Sanji finally leap out of the smoke carrying Edison. It's a terribly adapted scene for lots of reasons, but this essentially accomplishes two things for Sanji. The first is that it completely diminishes the speed that was portrayed in the manga. The idea of the scene was that Sanji was able to save Edison before he got hit by the laser, and Sanji appears on the ground in an instant. But the way it's portrayed in the anime is as if Sanji saved Edison after he got hit by the laser, in which case he's not very saved, because it takes almost 20 seconds from seeing Edison get hit to Sanji leaping into action. And look, I know that 20 seconds doesn't sound like a lot. Like everything else in this video, it's probably going to be labeled pedantic, etc. But 20 seconds is an awfully long time when you're getting shot at by a laser beam. And consider this, 20 seconds would be 2/3 of the time inflicted by Foxy's slow beam. So it took Sanji almost an entire slow beam to react to Edison being shot at all. And the reason why this happened is, again, because of filler. They can't have the scene play out with the tight timing that this sort of action scene needs. So there's this awkward 20 seconds where Toei just honestly don't know what to do, but they need the time there. We've got this 20 seconds where a character gets shot at, the character explodes, and then everyone stands there and assumedly looks at the remains of his robotic corpse falling to the ground, until it's revealed that Sanji somehow stepped in and saved Edison 20 seconds after he exploded. And then sometimes the anime just goes out of its way to play up Sanji's potential for weirdness, like taking this close-up from the manga and turning it into a close-up where it looks like Sanji is taking infinite backshots. Honestly, I don't mind that sort of artistic liberty. I really love the Sanji face. And the anime is an adaptation, so you know what? Make those expressions more extreme and defined, why not? But I would say it's applied in a very unbalanced way. With Sanji, these facial liberties get taken a lot more than every other Straw Hat. With every other character, the anime mostly sticks to exactly how Oda draws them. And so with Egghead Island especially, this sort of thing is a death by 1,000 cut situation for Sanji. Everything I've mentioned in this video is small, so very small, and these small things, they keep going wrong for Sanji. And so they eventually add up into a big thing, whether it's being beaten up and defeated by an opponent that gave him no trouble in the manga, whether it's simping over a child, being cut out of scenes entirely, or just generally having your presence rather diminished. And all of this has led to the meme that Vinsmoke Judge is the CEO of Toei, and doing all of this on purpose to take revenge on his son. Me personally, I don't believe this is malicious, and it does definitely happen to some extent with other crew members as well. It's not just Sanji. But the reason why we notice this so much with Sanji is because he actually has a decently active role in the story, whereas most Straw Hats kinda don't. A lot of them just get relegated to the background. And what that means is that Toei are forced to use Sanji a lot more to extend episodes, most of which is unnoticed and honestly goes quite well. But every now and then there's a filler scene of Sanji that's quite poorly thought out or implemented or both, and it's the culmination of these odd scenes that do make anime Sanji look like a bit of a joke compared to his manga counterpart. This doesn't happen with Zoro because there's a universal understanding that he needs to be cool, that's what he is, but Sanji has always been a more comedic character than Zoro, and so I think that gives the anime staff license to toss him around and make more fun of him than Zoro. And to be fair, that's exactly what Eiichiro Oda does in the manga as well, but the key difference is that Oda doesn't compromise the cool moments that Sanji does get, nor does he take the goofy ones too far, at least not since the nosebleed days of Fishman Island. I don't think that Toei hates Sanji. In fact, sometimes I think they may like him a little bit too much, which is where stuff like acting like a dog for Stussy comes from. My bet would be that a lot of people at Toei very much identify with Sanji and don't mind living vicariously through him from time to time, and so that barrier gets pushed a lot more than Oda does. And as much as I used to think that the Sanji diminishment was the irate ramblings of the internet, I do now very much understand where those people are coming from, as Toei does often undercut Sanji. That's probably not how they see it, a lot of it's probably accidental, but it is what it is. The number one best devil fruit in the series. This is canon after this. What is it?
Actually became a harder question than I realized.
What is the best part about One Piece?
The adventure. I think the adventure of the Straw Hats, and in all honesty, it is also the friends that you make along the way.
Aw, that is sickeningly sweet. Let's put a stop to that right now. What is the worst part about One Piece?
Oh, that's hard. There aren't enough chapters.
I agree with you. You are incessantly optimistic. Let's break you.
Oh, okay.
If you had to, which Straw Hat would you get rid of?
No! You can't ask me that.
I just did.
Oh, my brain. No, I can't.
You must.
Holy crap.
It's the requirement of the question.
Oh,
If you had to, notice how I prefaced it with that.
my heart's actually like palpitating right now. I can't. Oh, God. Okay. I don't know. Jinbei. I'm just gonna have to say Jinbei because he's the newest one. We haven't had the longest time with him yet, so I can't skip it. I want to skip this question.
There is no skipping, so Sophie hates Jinbei
Yeah.
confirmed.
All right. I hate Jinbei. Eat him up. Eat him up for emergency rations.
Let's talk about fictional fruit. Sophie, I've asked you to prepare something for me.
I did, and it actually became a harder question than I realized because you just said 5 worst, 5 best without any sort of context. So I've just taken the liberty to put 5 best in my personal opinion of what I would like to have in my life, as opposed to, in the context of actual One Piece.
Sophie, your number 5 best devil fruit in the series.
You didn't tell me that's what the context was.
I didn't say the ones you'd like most.
You said 5 best. That's a very broad category. So
And you've gone very narrow in that very broad category.
well, the one that I chose for number 5 was actually the Fuku Fuku no Mi.
You think Kinnamon's devil fruit is the 5th best in the series.
I just chose it because in terms of real life use, I don't have to go out, go shopping to buy new clothes. Would save a lot of time in the morning. I mean, I think, bam, new clothes. New outing, new outing.
You
wear.
would need a lot of leaves or rocks, though.
We're in Australia. We're surrounded by leaves and rocks.
It's true, we do have stuff. Sophie, the number 4 best devil fruit in the series.
I said mane mane no mi.
Okay, I think that's more reasonable.
Yeah.
Stop hitting yourself.
Okay.
This is
I was just seeing if it worked.
Are you hitting yourself on the right cheek?
No, I wasn't actually, but I've got limited space here.
All right, explain why you feel the need to take the forms of others.
I just think it's a really, really fun idea.
Identity theft.
Yeah, I think so.
Sophie, the number 3 best devil fruit in the series is...
I said the Poke Poke no Mi. Again, for its real life use.
Yeah, for anyone who's unaware, this is a devil fruit held by one of the Whitebeard commanders whose face you know, but whose name you don't know.
Yeah, I can't even remember the name right now.
I don't know if I'd call it the 3rd best devil fruit in the series, but it's pretty good.
Well, again, this is completely
No.
different context.
No, I gave you all the context you needed, and
I
you decided to interpret that as,
certainly
Liam asked
did
what
not.
Sophie would want most.
Yeah, because this is the best for me.
The silver medal, the 2nd best devil fruit in the series is...
I would actually say the Gomu Gomu no Mi. Especially, again, real life use. I'm a really short person. There are often situations in life where I can't reach things. So just being able to would be really good for me.
The number 1 best devil fruit in the series, according to Sophie. This is canon after this. What is it?
I am going to have to go a tie between the Tori Tori no Mi, Model Phoenix, or my all-time favorite has always been the Hana Hana no Mi. It's very Handy.
Handy.
You might
I knew you were
say.
going to do that. I knew you were going to do that.
How can we
What's
not?
happening? So let me get this straight. I asked you to give me a list of the top 5 best devil fruits, and you've given me the top 6 fruits that you would personally enjoy.
Yeah.
Why Marco's fruit?
I've always wanted to be able to fly. I just think it's got a sick aesthetic design, as well as the fact that, you know, it's super fast. It can regenerate, also has like basic healing powers in terms of abilities within the One Piece world, as well as in the real life world. Like, I could become a flying GP.
You know what you're doing, right? This is very Batman of you. In case anyone doesn't know, Sophie has a phobia of birds. So this is like taking the thing you fear the most and using its power.
Embodying it. Exactly.
And sticking with the flight, who do you think deserves to be called Dragon more? Dragon or Kaido?
Can we just call Kaido Dragon Kaido?
No, that's ridiculous. I don't know why you would suggest that.
I'm gonna say Dragon because that's his name.
Why should people subscribe to the Grand Line Review?
I don't know how it goes anymore. You've changed it recently, I feel like.
I've not changed it in like the last year.
Brings you consistent updates of consistent
Wow.
injections of
Such-
One Piece videos into your YouTube feed.
Yeah.
Was that well done?
I remember when you used to watch my videos. Back to fictional fruit now. Sophie,
All right.
I asked you to prepare another special thing.
Yes, you did. Yes, you did.
We are now going to go through the canonical top 5 worst devil fruits in the series. Sophie, the power is over to you. Number 5.
Number 5, the Baku Baku no Mi. There are just so many awesome, like, strong powers that you could have that it seems like a laborious task having to actually eat the weapon first. It seems impractical.
Number 4, the 4th worst devil fruit.
I said the Kuku Kuku no Mi. I don't know. It's just not that impressive.
3rd worst devil fruit.
This might be a bit controversial. I said the Yomi Yomi no Mi, which is Brook's devil fruit. But that was because just personally, the idea of having to revive after I already died, that terrifies me. Like, I just, you know, if I'm dead, I'm dead. I don't want to have to come back.
Interesting. So once you die, you sort of develop a life phobia? Is that what I'm hearing?
Exactly, yeah. I've committed to death.
Sophie, the 2nd worst devil fruit in the series is...
Hina's the bind fruit or the cage fruit. Like, it's good for her because, you know, her role, but
It is pretty much the only possible thing she can do in life with that devil fruit.
exactly.
The number 1 canonically worst devil fruit in the series. If you have a problem with it, email Sophie. What is it?
Tamago's Tama Tama no Mi.
Oh!
So I've come full circle with this bird phobia thing. So top 1, also bird. Lowest one, also a bird. Yeah.
Top lowest one, also bad.
I suppose it's similar to the reviving thing. Not only is it like you're reviving, but you're reviving. It's like a chicken. I don't know. It's just
So it's the worst of both worlds for you. You're dying, you're committing to dying.
Exactly.
No. You're not committing to dying, and you're coming back to life as a bird. I don't think there's anyone else in this world who would call that the number 1 worst, but because it combines both of your phobias, I guess I understand.
not for me.
Speaking of revival, what Straw Hat mentor would you bring back to life?
Oh. See, I just told you I'm clumsy.
What's that?
Maybe Clover, just because I'm really interested in the lore and things like that.
Not say Robin's mother, who probably knows as much.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say I like. I like Why
We
not?
already have a Robin. What is your favorite laugh in One Piece?
Oh, God, you can't make me laugh whilst I'm doing the laugh leave. It's not fair. Screwed it up again. Damn it. It's my favorite laugh, but it upsets me a lot that I can't do it.
So now that I know you like to laugh, I've got some One Piece jokes for you if you'd be interested. And I'm
right.
going to put this out there. I don't care if you're not because I've prepared them.
Okay, all right, hit me.
These jokes do not come from me. They come from the Grand Fleet, and I am going to ask you to rate them out of 10.
Okay.
What did Brook order from Baratier?
What?
He ordered some spare ribs.
I'm gonna give that a 6.
What is Kizaru's favorite band?
What?
One Direction.
And I give it a 7.
What do Big Mom and a school bus have in common?
What?
They've both been filled with children.
Oh. Wow. I'm gonna give 9.
What does Kaya say when she leaves to go to the store?
What?
I'm going, Mary.
I'm gonna give that a 7 as well.
Do you know what Fujitori used to do before he joined the Marines?
No.
He used to be a professional circumciser, but unfortunately one day he got the sack.
Alright, I'm gonna give that a solid 8.
Okay, so the Big Mom school bus joke is the winner of today's joke off. One of my favorite arcs in the series is of course Water 7 and Eni Slobby, and I would love to know who was right, Luffy or Usopp.
Oh, God.
No, that was not one of the options.
God was right. God is. I think Luffy was right, but he should have handled that with a lot more sensitivity.
Sophie, do you like to play games?
What if I said no?
Well, it doesn't matter. Again, like the jokes, I don't care what you want to do. I've set it up, so we're going to do it. Are you ready to play Hat in a Bag?
Okay, sure.
Would you like to know the rules, or should we just do it?
Just do it.
No, I think you should know the rules. So inside this bag is a One Piece themed hat, and it's going to be your job to guess which hat it is.
Okay.
In that effort, you get to ask me 3 yes or no questions, after which point you will need to guess which One Piece hat is in the bag.
All right then.
Are you ready to play Hat in a Bag?
I am so. Is it worn by a female?
No.
Does it have a rim/visor?
Visor.
Like, like the thing at the front?
So specifically a rim visor or a rim?
no,
because
all-
almost
like,
all
so-
hats have rims.
Exactly. So does it have a rim/ something at the front? Isn't that what it's called? A visor? Like when it's just at the front, like a cap?
Yeah, it is a hat, so it does have a rim.
Oh, it does have a rim. It's definitely
Yes.
a hat.
It's definitely a hat.
Is it worn by a pirate?
Yes. So what we know is that it's a hat worn by a male pirate. Good luck.
Don't tell me it's the straw hat.
Is that your guess?
Yes, it's going to be my guess. Or it could be Roger's straw hat. It could be the giant straw hat at Marajua.
I'm gonna make you pick because the giant straw hat is different from Luffy's straw hat.
Exactly. So I'm going to say the giant straw hat because Luffy's straw hat would be way too predictable.
Well, let's find out if you were correct.
Okay.
You
All
were
right.
not. It was Ace's hat.
Fair
He
enough.
doesn't really need any more these days.
No, because he's committed. Or at least Oda committed to this one at least.
Well, I apologize on your loss in today's Hat in a Bag, but it was your own fault.
I mean, well, maybe it was your fault. How come you didn't source a giant hat?
I would have had to get a giant bag. Who is the next straw hat?
Tamago.
Unexpected. I imagine you'll be very disappointed by that. Who is the most overrated Emperor of the Sea?
Maybe Shanks because we don't actually haven't seen the full capabilities yet. So at the moment, he might be just being overrated.
Sophie hates Shanks. Sophie hates Jinbei. Sophie hates One Piece. Thank you
Yep.
so much, Sophie.
No worries, thank you.